September 22nd. We are testing our mic. You read me loud and clear.
We can hear you, Katie.
Thank you.
If everyone could find their seats, we can get started, please. No, that was not me. I would not have put the candy on here. It was Gil, but I was going to round it all up. No plow through. Reno's connected. Can you hear us in Reno?
Yes, we hear you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and call to order the meeting of the Nevada Board of Wildlife Commissioners for Saturday, September 22nd, 2018. Vice Chairman Valentine, would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please? Yes, I will. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Jordan, could you call the roll of the commission, please?
Chairman Johnston.
Here.
Vice Chairman Valentine. Here. Commissioner Almberg. Here. Commissioner Barnes. Here. Commissioner Cavilla. Here. Commissioner East. Here. Commissioner Hubbs. Commissioner McNinch. Commissioner Keel.
Would the county advisory boards please stand and announce their presence? Is there any cabs present in Reno?
Go ahead.
Glenn Bunch, Mineral. Steve Robinson, Washoe.
Thank you. We can move on to agenda item number 13, approval of the agenda. The commission will review the agenda and may take action to approve the agenda. The commission may remove items from the agenda, continue items for consideration, or take items out of order. I do have one request that we have the mule deer population report or status update, that be at the call of the chair. Commissioner East has to leave by, I think, 11:30 to catch a flight back to Reno to attend a wedding, and that is one thing that of the report she really wants to hear, and I think it's important. So that'd be one comment that I have with respect to the agenda. Any other comments or questions regarding the agenda? This is an action item. Any public comment in Reno with respect to the agenda?
No comment in Reno.
Thank you. Any public comment in Las Vegas? Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the commission for any further discussion or preferably a motion. Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to approve the agenda as presented with item 16F being at the call of the chair.
Okay, I have a motion by Commissioner McNinch with a second by Commissioner East to approve the agenda as presented, with the exception that item 16F will be at the call of the chair. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries unanimously 9-0. Move on to agenda item number 14, member items, announcements, and correspondence. Commissioners may present emergent items. No action may be taken by the commission. Any item requiring commission action may be scheduled on a future commission agenda. The commission will review and may discuss correspondence sent or received by the commission since the last regular meeting and may provide copies for the exhibit file. Commissioners may provide hard copies of their correspondence for the written record. Correspondence sent or received by Secretary Wosley may also be discussed. Any member items or announcements? just announce that today is fittingly, per Governor Sandoval's proclamation, Nevada's official hunting and fishing day. I guess I just received a correspondence. I don't know who sent it to me, but it appears that it was a note on the Nevada Wildlife Commission rejected 410 and 28 gauges for turkey hunting today. So pot, prostitution, and gambling are legal, but sub-gauge turkey hunting is not. That appears to be posted by Mr. Bronson on some form of social media, who was the person from Federal Premium. I find the comment, it is what it is, but I guess I did receive that correspondence, and will make mental note of, I guess they're questioning some of the things that go on in this state. But any other member items, announcements? Secretary Wasley, do you have anything today? We'll go ahead then and close agenda item number 14. Move on to agenda item number 15, County Advisory Boards to manage wildlife member items. CAB members may present emergent items. No action may be taken by the commission. Any item requiring commission action will be scheduled on a future commission agenda. First in Reno, anything from the Washoe County CAB?
Comment in Reno, Commissioner.
Thank you. Any CAB comment here in Clark County? Seeing none, we'll close agenda item number 15 and move on to number 16, reports informational. And if Cody's ready to go, can you do it now? All right, well, let's call 16F, Mule Deer Population Status Update. Wildlife Staff Specialist Cody Schroeder. A presentation will be provided on the current status of Nevada's mule deer population. Mr. Schroeder, good to see you.
For the record, Cody Schroeder, Staff Specialist, Department of Wildlife. Where they're getting this loaded, just like to address Commissioner Johnson, members of the commission. Welcome new commissioners. It was nice meeting you this morning. I do have a lengthy presentation this morning. It's about an hour's worth, so and I'll try to go through it fairly thoroughly. So if you have questions, I'm going to pause a few times throughout just to take a few questions, and then of course at the end I'd be happy to answer any as well. Okay, so I'm just going to start off with a kind of a brief outline of what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to start out with mule deer and really put it into a broad perspective. I'm going to talk about range-wide status of mule deer and really about throughout their whole distribution in North America. Then I'm going to kind of bring it back into Nevada and talk about populations in Nevada and go back in history. Put it in the context of other populations in Nevada, other big game species, and how mule deer compare to other big game species. I'm going to talk about some of the potential reasons for some of the historic population declines and some of the stuff we're seeing recently. Talk about habitat and environmental conditions. I got a little section on nutritional ecology of ruminants. So this is almost straight up animal science. And I promise it's not too complicated, but I'll explain it to my best of my ability. Density dependence is something that we talk about occasionally at commission meetings, and I've brought it up, and it's a confusing, but it's strong theory, and I'm going to present a lot of math and graphs behind density dependence theory in ungulates. Talk a little bit about impacts of fire, what we're seeing historically and more recently on mule deer, and I have some material on predation management, and then finally I'm going to kind of wrap it all up with some of the current management issues that are going on in Nevada right now. So, to put this into broad perspective, mule deer are very widely distributed throughout North America. So the gray shading here shows their current distribution. The map says status of blacktail and mule deer. For the purposes of this, we can consider blacktail and mule deer pretty much the same. They're the same genus. They're technically different subspecies. But the important thing to note is their far-ranging distribution ranges from the west coast to pretty much west of the Mississippi. And these polygons, the shaded polygons here in the center, are the sagebrush biome and you can have the different colors are sort of broken out by the different ecoregions. So if you look in Nevada there, we have a large part of the southern Great Basin, we have the northern Great Basin, a little bit of the Snake River Plain. And the reason I want to focus on that is this is where you actually see the highest concentrations of mule deer in North America is. These areas, mule deer occur where there's not sagebrush, like for instance the Mojave Desert down into the Sonora in Mexico, but the largest concentrations of mule deer are in that sagebrush biome. And that's a real concern for us as deer managers and ecologists, because we know that the sagebrush ecosystem is shrinking and it's got a lot of threats facing it, including wildfire, drought, and just development in general. But if you look across there, you see Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, Oregon, and Nevada are really the overlap, the highest concentrations of mule deer. And I'm going to go into the detail about some of those populations here in a few. This is just, I pulled this out of the WAFWA report. Every year, the Mule Deer Working Group and WAFWA submits a report to WAFWA. All the states submit their population estimates. Nevada's right here in the middle. This was our current estimate of 92,000 mule deer statewide. Our total harvest is around 7,000. 83% of the males approximately in the harvest, or 83% of the harvest was males. And we had about 16,000 hunters just for mule deer that actually had a tag in their pocket going into the season. So to put it in context, you can see we're right there in the middle. Obviously, some of our surrounding states, Colorado, Utah, have much higher populations. We're about a quarter of the population of Colorado. Idaho, we're about a third. Oregon, we're about half of the population estimates for those states. But you can see some of the more broad-ranging, like the Yukon, for instance, has much lower densities. And so I just grabbed these four examples to kind of provide some context. Now I realize the time scale on these is not directly comparable, so I'm going to walk you through them step by step. Colorado provided data back to about the early 2000s, so you can see their populations are about around 400,000 statewide, but they've lost over 200,000 mule deer just since about 2006. And if we were to take that back to the 80s, they had even much higher populations than that. They were over 700,000 in the peak of the 80s, Colorado. So they've seen decline similar to what Nevada's experiencing. If we go to the right, over to the right, look at Oregon. The blue line there is their population estimate. And this one goes back much farther, so 1980 is the start of the scale on this, and that's really when their populations, they think, peaked out as well. They've been on kind of a continual slide down, sort of up and down throughout the 90s, and really their population estimate now is around 200,000, 100,000 less than it was in 1988. They provide some other metrics on there, such as their buck ratios. I'm not going to focus on that for today. If you go down to the lower left-hand panel and you look at New Mexico, now this one's a bit deceiving. This data, and I apologize, it's hard to read, but that line starts in 1953. So they went way back. Now this is showing their estimated harvest. They're not even reporting their population estimates. They really don't feel like they had accurate population estimates. They weren't censusing that far back, but their harvest is very accurate. And harvest generally follows population trends. You'll see that in a few slides here that I have, but really they peaked out in the 50s with their harvest. They were harvesting over 50,000 mule deer. Now they're down around 10,000 statewide. And that green line, that's hunter numbers. And so you can see they've had, I don't know exactly when they opened their draw system, but that pretty much tracks where their populations are going. So there are much fewer hunter opportunities because those populations are declining and because their harvest has been down. Utah, I threw that on there because that kind of bucks the trend. Now their data that they're showing only goes back to the early 90s, but they've actually seen a little bit of it. They've had some up and downs as well, and if we were to project this back to the 80s, they were much higher. But right now they're around 360,000 population estimate, and really the last 4 or 5 years they've seen increases in their populations. They've invested highly in their habitat initiative, and they've been fortunate to have some good conditions, some monsoonal moisture conditions and things like that, that they think helps explain that. There's some other factors in there as well. backing up real quick, I just wanted to put that into sort of context of what some of the other states around us are experiencing, you know, back in time and more recently. So this next figure will be familiar to those of you who may have read our Mule Deer Bulletin that Director Wasley published in 2004. So this is a reconstructed population estimate going way back in time, late 1800s. Now the data, as we go back in time, is obviously a little more sparse. These are basically reconstructed from some of the early pioneers, some of the miners that were really, really some of the really early explorers took very detailed journal, you know, detailed journal entries that we've kind of been able to reconstruct. And then starting in about the late 1900s, the newspapers actually used to report population estimates, and because there was a lot of interest around the meat market hunting industry. But what you can see right off is that in the early 1900s and even before that, mule deer were just, in Nevada, were just very, very sparse when you look at it on a statewide perspective. And then we see these big peaks. So we had an eruption in the 1950s. We had another one in the 60s. We had a depression from about 1965 to 1980, span of 15 years where we were down around 100,000. And then we saw this big peak in the 80s. And so as the data, as you get farther, closer in time, really we can be more confident in some of those population estimates. That's the 1950s are really when we started doing kind of formal censuses. In 1975 is when Nevada implemented the draw system. And we started doing population estimates with like computer models and things like that. So this one is another graph that I found interesting. I pulled this out of an old report in one of our agency files that George Gruhl, retired Forest Service biologist. This is showing the number of deer on the Humboldt-Toyabe. It's actually the Humboldt National Forest was now the Humboldt-Toyabe from 1917 to 1954. And it tracks that graph, you know, albeit much truncated. These were reports that George took from newspapers, but really he drew with U.S. Forest Reserves as one of the first natural resource agencies in Nevada in the early 1900s. This was a precursor to the U.S. Forest Service. It's called the Forest Reserve System. And this data from about 1929 on was compiled by forest districts. So you're looking at what is now basically Area 6, Area 7, and Area 10 compiled into one. That was where the bulk of this reporting came from. And there were reports in there, if you look at 1919, of less than 50 deer being observed in the entire, what they called the Jarbidge district at the time. And the harvest was like less than 10. So they did their best to, of course there wasn't mandatory reporting in 1917, but anecdotal reports and things like miners recording their activity. Fast forward to about the 40s, okay? And that's really when mule deer started taking off. And the Forest Service took very detailed records. They actually did censuses, horseback censuses back in the day. And we see this eruption about the 1950s. Okay, so that population estimate, if you look on the y-axis, was around 22,000 for Area 6, Area 7, and Area 10 combined in 1950. And that's roughly what it is today, actually. So now we're going to look at some more contemporary population estimates going back to 1975. As I mentioned before, that's when Nevada instituted the limited draw system. The y-axis is our published population estimates. The black line is the estimate. On the z-axis there is our harvest. So you can see it very closely tracks the populations, which makes sense because it's a limited draw system, so we're basically limiting the hunter harvest by our population estimates. And so again, we see that sort of low population estimate down around 100,000 in the mid-70s, big peak in the 80s, the late 80s it peaked out, and then we saw this pretty steep decline into the early 2000s. And really we've been kind of flat since then, where there is a kind of a downward trend. This line that I'm showing you right here is the average harvest over that entire time span. So that's 40 years. Now the average is kind of misleading on this because you've got that big peak in the 80s bringing it up. But on average, it's about 10,000 mule deer harvested annually if you go back to 1975 until now. If we look at more recent times and you just kind of piecemeal that and you go back to the early thousands, that green dashed line right there is a little over 7,000 mule deer harvested annually. So we've been actually above that, we've been below that, and last year we were right on almost the about 18-year mean for harvest. That's total harvest, bucks and does included in there. So if we start thinking about, you know, well, why are we seeing these trends? One of the things that we collect and we talk about a lot is our fawn ratio. And really when we see, I have the y-axis observed fawn ratio here, that's really what our recruitment is. We're capturing that data in the spring. We're counting the number of fawns per adults. I've mentioned this before, but in the springtime, you know, we can't get a buck to doe ratio or a fawn to doe ratio because they don't have antlers. So we put it on a per adult basis. And this closely tracks the population trends. But really what's kind of more disturbing there is that there's kind of a downward trend overall. And we saw a big drop. Heavy winter in 1992-93 was a really heavy winter, so we saw a really, really low depressed. That's kind of an anomaly, really, out of that system. If you go back to more contemporary times, you know, we've had 3 or 4 years above the mean and several years below that sort of trend line. The R squared there is just explaining the variation. The year, it doesn't do a great job of explaining variation because there's a lot of other factors, such as moisture and things like that, that are actually probably accounting for that fawn ratio variation. I've got a lot more material on that. So when we put it in the context of other populations, other big game species, here I'm showing the mule deer is the white dashed line on the y-axis going back to 1980. And then you've got, I'm sorry, on the z-axis. On the y-axis, we have all the other big game species. And the reason I did that is just because the scale is so much different than if you try to put them all in the same, it kind of squashes the trend data. So that white line is really the same line that you were looking at before with the population estimate of mule deer. If we look at the green line, that's our antelope population going back to 1980. You'll see that you can see it started around 10,000. This is on a per thousand basis, around 10,000 antelope, and it's close to 30,000 with our most recent efforts. So really, really good success story there. If you go to elk, the purple line, we really started tracking those in the 90s, early 90s. We were down below 2,500 elk. And we peaked out in about 2015, 2016, at close to 20,000 elk. I think it was just shy around 18,000 before we seen these more recent declines. Now the elk, I should mention, we've had a lot of aggressive harvest management on elk, and so we were trying to drive the elk population down with some of our cow harvests and things like that. Some of the other populations, such as bighorn, again, conservation success story, around 2,000 desert bighorn sheep statewide in the early 80s. Now we're close to 10,000 desert sheep statewide. And I remember, just kind of anecdotally, so a couple years ago, I was sitting in my office, and Mike Cox's office is pretty close to mine, and I could hear some shouting down the hall, and I hear 10,000. I'm like, what in the heck is he talking about? Well, he was compiling the annual population estimates, and it was the year that we had finally hit 10,000 desert bighorn sheep, and he really was celebrating that by whooping and hollering in his hall, and he was excited to put that in the big game status report. You look at other bighorn species, now they get a little bit squashed on this scale, but California bighorn have been increasing, but we're much lower statewide population. We just don't have as many. In Rocky Mountains, it's pretty much flat on this, but we did see increases till about the early mid-2000s, and then in recent times we've seen some declines due to some disease and die-off issues. So if we talk about sort of some of the reasons, the causes for these population declines, if we go back in time, we know that market hunting by some of the early settlers, it was basically unregulated hunting. Okay, people were just out meat hunting, there was no regulations. They harvested a lot of animals, and there were fewer of them at the time. Disease is something that we didn't know a whole lot about until recently, but we're finding that there's things like hemorrhagic disease, blue tongue, BVDV is bovine viral diarrhea virus. These things have been circulating in mule deer probably for decades, but we're sort of just now finding out about them because some of the more advanced methods we're using for testing blood and things like that. But they probably came from livestock when livestock were introduced to the Great Basin in the 1800s, and they live with them, but they can have population impacts. They cause poor recruitment essentially, and we can have epizootics throughout the time with EHD particularly. Drought conditions, we know those have existed throughout time, but more recently we've really been looking at a lot of more severe drought conditions. Poor range conditions, there were millions of livestock in the late 1800s, early 1900s. There were an estimate of over 4 million domestic sheep, I think, in Nevada alone, and we think that caused some of the degradation, some of the range. The thing to note about all this is that mule deer have persisted through many decades despite all these sort of factors facing against them. And if we look at some of the other big game species, those population trajectories that I showed you, those are actually species that we've had intensive management, so we've introduced those species. So we've been augmenting, we've been translocating bighorn sheep. We introduced elk to Nevada. So you're talking about an unoccupied habitat. You put a new prey species in there, it flourishes because there's essentially unlimited resources when the populations first get introduced. But over time, and mule deer have been here for much longer than these other species. And so I think personally that has contributed to those population trajectories that we've been seeing. There are other factors as well, but our intensive management of those other species, our translocations, our introductions of them to new unoccupied habitats partially explains why we've seen increases in some of our other big game, whereas we've seen these big fluctuations and even declines in mule deer. So more recently, this is a list I put together of just population declines that have been published in peer-reviewed literature in fairly recent times. So on the left-hand side, we just have sort of the ultimate cause, sort of the broad picture cause of their decline. The reference is the publication, so if you want to go look these up, you can literally look these up. And then sort of the direct mechanism, more of the proximate cause, but it's a wide variety of stuff on there, unfortunately. Sort of climate change in general, environmental variability causes poor recruitment and changes in habitat quality. Top one there, DeVos and McKinney. We see some predation on there, having impacts on adult survival, Blake and Taylor 1988 and Hamlin 84, that's from Montana, showing impacts of coyote fawn predation. Environmental conditions, again, that one comes up a lot. I have them kind of intermixed here with climate change, but really what we're talking about is drought conditions and severe winter conditions, kind of the interaction between those two causing population declines. Some of the more recent data publications have shown increased highway traffic. If you look at Code 2015, that showed a direct impact from highway collisions and this is from Oregon, deer vehicle collisions. They actually attributed that to some of their population declines in central Oregon. If you go kind of down the list a little bit, you'll see residential and energy development. Johnson 2017, they really were able to show in Colorado that housing development along the Front Range in Colorado, along with oil and gas development on Winter Range, has really been correlated strongly with poor fawn recruitment, and they think that's explaining some of their declines in Colorado. And then finally on the bottom there, we just look at just landscape changes in general. The Mule Deer Working Group has put out a lot of literature, and I have a little bit more at the end of the presentation. It really varies widely by region, ecoregion, but there's many, many things on a landscape scale that have impacted mule deer. So I've just kind of put these pictures to words here, some of these population declines. I've broken them down into 3 categories here. On the left-hand side, we have habitat quality. The middle, we have land use change, and then in the right-hand column, we have climate change. And so if we look at habitat quality, if you look at that top left-hand panel, you might think that looks like decent mule deer habitat. There's, some sagebrush there, some good grass. But really, if you kind of look closely, the age of that sagebrush is what is the issue there. It's probably an 80 to 100-year-old plant, and what sagebrush does over time is it creates a lot more volatile oils, tannins in there, and even though mule deer will eat it, the quality of that sagebrush declines when you get post about 50, 60 years. So if you kind of go down a little bit further, you see that's an enclosure, an exclosure actually, from grazing. So, and not specific to livestock, this could be, you know, all ungulate grazing, really. That's just where there's no grazing at all. No cattle grazing, no elk, no mule deer. And you'll see around it, there's some overutilization of that range right there. And then in the bottom panel, that's a familiar picture to many in Nevada. That was taken actually outside of Lovelock off of I-80. That's a sea of cheatgrass, unfortunately, with a little bit of sagebrush in there. And that's what we consider, what we call type conversion. Really poor quality range for mule deer, unfortunately. We look at land use changes. There could be competitors on the landscape. I'm showing elk here, but really you could put all ungulates on there, you know, cattle, sheep, other wild ungulates, horses. If we go down to the middle, that's kind of one that hits home. That picture was taken right outside of Reno, just outside of Peavine Mountain, really, and housing development encroaching up the hill into winter range for mule deer. And that's been documented in the scientific literature. I just showed you some references there. If you go on to the bottom panel, that's an open pit mine. You could easily put oil and gas in there. And the reason I put that in there is these occur oftentimes in constricted areas, so migration corridors, so they cause impediments. Now that's not directly, I'm not trying to attribute mining to mule deer. I'm just throwing that out there that one of them factors, west-wide really, is impediments in migration corridors. Things like transmission lines, oil drilling, and open pit mining. If we go to the right, climate change gets thrown out there a lot, but really what we're talking about is drought conditions and severe winters. One of the things that we're dealing with climate change is variability in climate. So we'll have several severe years of drought followed by a really heavy winter, or precipitation coming down all at one time, such as that bottom lower right panel. These unfortunate mule deer find themselves with, I don't think that picture is actually taken from Nevada. I think it's from Colorado, I believe. But if you just look at last year, we saw this in real time. December and January were very, very dry in Nevada. And then we got all of our moisture in 1 month, essentially. They were calling it Miracle March. I've got an RGJ article on my wall in my office. Those are not conducive to mule deer because it's less predictable. They get a lot of snow. They were dealing with drought conditions, and now all of a sudden they've got, you know, so much snow they don't know how to deal with it. So I'm going to talk about habitat conditions, and the next few slides I'm going to reference this thing we call NDVI. What the heck is NDVI? Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. So basically what this is satellites circulating the globe. They launched them starting in the 80s, take pictures, they rotate around the Earth, and we can quantify by the spectral signature the amount of the greenness, basically, in the environment. And this has been really becoming a hot, you know, scientific endeavor for ecologists. There's all kinds of different measures of NDVI, but it's really used as a measure by ecologists to quantify forage quality, not just for mule deer, but for wildlife in general. But it's especially useful for mule deer because mule deer, as I'm going to describe here in a bit, are their diets require a high quality forage compared to other species such as elk. And we know that is a direct measure of their body fat reserves. It increases their body fat levels, and that directly contributes to fawn recruitment and survival. All right, so this is a picture that I borrowed from a colleague at Utah State, David Stoner, in a published journal. And what they did is they took all this data, this NDVI data satellite, and they compiled it into a large-scale study site. So you can see a big portion of the Great Basin, but also the Colorado Plateau. The scale is in the lower left-hand corner there. So the green areas correlate to high NDVI values, basically more green situations. The brown is low NDVI, so low spectral signature from green plants. And the reason I wanted to throw this on here, and this is showing the mean over about 14 years in the Great Basin, is several reasons. Really, if you put this into broad context, and you look at Utah, you look at Colorado, you look at portions of Arizona and New Mexico, they really have a lot of high quality forage for mule deer, a lot of green areas. If you look at the Great Basin in Nevada particularly, it's much more spotty, okay? But you do see productive areas. The one that stands out to me there is the Ruby Mountains. If you can kind of orient yourself just above the basin and Great Basin there, it really stands out. It's a very highly productive system. If you've ever been in the Ruby Mountains, you'll see it immediately when you step out on the ground. It's just lush and green everywhere. It looks like the Rocky Mountains to the east. But it's really isolated, and it's sort of these sky island situations, our basin and range topography, really that green productive forage is kind of relegated to higher elevations, mountain ranges in Nevada. One of the things that we can do with NDVI is we can look at long-term trends, but we can also kind of look at anomalies. So what this is showing is on the left-hand panel, showing high NDVI, and the color scale here is a little bit different, but the blue is the highest, averaged over the growing season. So that's really from spring about, starting in April through probably the end of September, sort of averaged over that area. The green is still high, but a little bit less, and then the white is really the lowest. And then on the right-hand panel, this red and blue is really showing the deviations from the mean. So if it's red, it's below that 0 level. That's really showing drastic deviations below the normal NDVI. So we can infer that this is poor quality forage, just sort of on a large landscape level. And the authors of this study weren't particularly looking at Nevada. They were really pulled data from Utah and Arizona. But it shows you in 2002 was just a drought year, really, and it's this anomaly in NDVI, this forage quality index. Drastic change from the mean. All right, so if we kind of directly tie this more to mule deer productivity. And so what we're seeing here is the authors of this study, Utah, they took population data from different states. They mostly looked at Utah and Arizona, but they took their sort of localized population estimates, so like on a hunt unit basis or a individual herd unit basis, and they correlated that with this positive NDVI, okay? And so they have it on a mule deer density. You can think of this on the y-axis as like deer per square mile. And so there's several things that we can sort of explain in this figure. One, that just in general, there's more mule deer where there's higher productive and higher amounts of green forage, but also that variability around the line. So it shows the confidence intervals there. So if you kind of look at the green box there in the right-hand corner, that's related to the green circle, okay? So the important thing to point out about this is, one, in general, it's a much more productive system. But in that year, when they took the estimate, under those conditions, that dot is above the mean. So in high NDVI conditions, in high moisture years, green forage, we can expect higher populations of mule deer. If you go to the opposite end of the spectrum, that's what the sort of the brown circle on the left hand is showing, and that corresponds to the lower right-hand panel. So different ecosystem. So in general, you're going to have lower productivity whether you're above or below the mean. In general, that's one thing to note. So populations like the Mojave Desert, you can expect just lower mule deer abundance in general. But within that system, you can have high years of productivity and low years of productivity based on this NDVI value, this greenness value of forage quality. And it's a really strong correlation there. Explains 60% of the variation in mule deer abundance alone. The authors of this study correlated that to this NDVI difference. Okay, and so what that means is there's still some unexplained variation in mule deer densities. 40%, it could be predation, it could be disease, it could be hunting even if you were over-harvesting. But 60%, and that's a lot on a landscape scale project like study like this, is explained by this one index, greenness in the environment. Very important for mule deer populations. All right, so what the authors of this study did, they took those estimates and they sort of they build a model. Okay, so they're going to project population abundance, and they put it in a map. And this is just, again, you can pretty much just flip the colors here, and where you saw green before, now you see red, which is mule deer abundance. On the lower left-hand corner, it shows the scale there, so the red is higher mule deer abundance, and low is the blue. And again, just reiterating this point, if you look to our neighbors, Utah, Colorado, even parts of Arizona and New Mexico, just a much larger area of land that they have the conditions where they could have higher mule deer abundance. Great Basin in Nevada particularly, much more isolated. But we do have these pockets of great habitat, such as the Ruby Mountains that I mentioned, such as Area 6, such as some of the stuff along the Sierra Front, eastern Nevada, the Shell Creek Range, White Pine County, and things like that. We really just don't have the inherent forage availability and quality to have populations sizes such as some of these other states. But the same model still applies. When you have green conditions and good times, you can expect higher mule deer abundances. This is some data that I put together for this. I pulled data from the U.S. Drought Monitor going back to the early 2000s. On the top panel, what this is showing is this is the percent of the state covered in a certain drought category. Okay, so if it's white, there's no drought conditions. If it's yellow, it's abnormally dry. Beige color, you know, we're looking at moderate drought to severe, and then that sort of red to maroon, we're in exceptional drought. And so there's several things we can pull out of this data. Just looking at it, we see going back to 2000, we've had 3 major drought periods. Those three bars that really covered the whole state. And then we see, if we kind of look down on the graph, what I've done here is I've plotted on the same time scale observed spring fawn ratios. So again, going back to that recruitment value. And it's not a perfect fit, but what we see is some kind of general trends where when we're in these big drought conditions, we've had depressed observed spring fawn ratios. So our recruitment is depressed, and then sort of in these relief periods, which are much shorter. If you look at those time periods, the white between the yellow and the red, they're much shorter, unfortunately. That's one of the trends we're seeing in mule deer populations. And so that fits pretty well. And really, if we look at a time scale, we look at more recent times going back to about 2013, you can see there's much more red. About 40% of the entire state was in extreme drought conditions from 2013 to 2015. And so we're just now kind of getting out of that drought, but we're actually starting to get back into drought conditions, unfortunately, now. That's what that yellow on the very extreme end, that's, I think, 2018 data there. All right, so this is a figure that is definitely familiar to some, specifically Director Wasley. I took this out of the Mule Deer Bulletin. And actually, I'm going to skip forward to this one for a second. This is what Tony did here was he plotted the statewide population estimate with average monthly precipitation. And he looked at different months, but really it was summer moisture, July through September, that explained a lot of this variation. And that's a very tight correlation. So the left-hand side, the bars are the statewide population estimate. The line is the monthly average, then inches there on the z-axis. And we see it really tracks closely, this population estimate, with our summer moisture conditions. So that's showing population estimates from 1976 up through 2000. If we go back just a little, one slide here, this is more of a quantifiable way to put this together. So he's got population estimate on the y-axis here, shown with average precip. Again, July through September on this is put it on a 6-year sliding average. And so he just did a regression here, and it's the same kind of principle. That R-squared value, 80% of the variation in those statewide population estimates can be explained by this sort of summer moisture patterns. This was data taken from the Gibbs Ranch from July to September 1978 to 2002. I'm showing the source there at the bottom. This is available on our website, Mule Deer Population Dynamics and Influences, written by Director Wasley. All right, so now I want to take a moment and sort of explain into the weeds, so to speak, about nutrition and how that impacts mule deer. At this point, are there any questions? I have a lot more material to cover, so I don't want to like gloss by it too fast, but are there any quick questions that the commission has at this point about populations? Commissioner Hubbs.
I just had a question that came to my mind when I was looking at the graph. The increase in the pronghorn population seemed to correlate to obviously the decrease in the mule deer populations. And you did mention competition, but do you think it's more just a change of habitat that's more conducive for pronghorn, or do you think that potentially pronghorn have harmed deer populations or outcompeted them in those areas?
Right.
It was right around the 90s, I think it was.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I've thought about that, and I actually went into literature and looked to see, because that's come up before at some of the calves as well. I really don't think it's a direct comparison. When we're talking about competitors, we're talking probably more about like things like elk or cattle. Those are more documented, and even elk, it's got to be on a very specific sort of small winter range type basis. I think that trend that you observed has more to do with the changes in the habitat conditions and really our efforts to restore pronghorn populations, which were nearly extirpated by the early 1900s. I mean, there were literally captive facilities in Reno where they were, and that's the whole reason the Sheldon Wildlife Refuge was created, is to try to conserve some of these areas for pronghorn. And then we started a pretty aggressive translocation effort. And so when you think about those populations, if you're taking pronghorn and you're putting them in an unoccupied habitat, that's good habitat for them, you can expect those populations to increase. And so when you look at it kind of on a statewide level, I think the changes in the habitat quality and our efforts to restore pronghorn to sort of their native herds, unoccupied territories, has more explanatory power. I have not been able to find direct evidence of pronghorn and mule deer on a large-scale competition. Some of the other species, there are some publications. For instance, I mentioned elk. But really, when we look at Nevada on a statewide level, we have populations across the state, and we only have elk in certain parts of the state, and we've seen mule deer declines in parts where we have not elk. So that you can't really make a direct competitive comparison there. Does that answer your question? All right, seeing no more, I'm going to move on to mule deer nutrition. So I want to put this into context, really, of just herbivores in general. And so really what we're talking about for the purposes of this is grazers and browsers, the differences between the two. Primarily grazers eat plant tissue that's leaf tissue, and browsers woody tissue. The important thing from mule deer nutrition is this cellulose, and the animals can't actually digest cellulose on their own. So they have to have this sort of symbiotic relationship with bacteria and protozoa in their gut that processes the plant and breaks down cellulose and converts it into energy and protein. And so on the right-hand side, we see this is just a generalized ruminant stomach that cows, sheep, and deer have. It's a 4-chambered stomach. There's a lot of differences between the species, which is why I put the photos of the cow, the sheep, and the mule deer on there. And in general, you can the size of these different chambers and sort of these different evolutionary adaptations that the different herbivores have are really what's important when we're talking about diet and nutrition in mule deer. So cows have a very large rumen. Mule deer have a fairly small rumen, comparatively speaking, and sheep are kind of in the middle there. And sheep are generally considered more grazers, similar to cows, and mule deer are considered more browsers. So taking that a step further, there's also other herbivores out there, things like rabbits, horses, considered non-ruminant. So if you look at their stomach, they don't have the 4-chambered, highly evolved ruminant system like cows and sheep do. They have a really simple system, a simple stomach system, and they digest their forage in the cecum. Really, they have a lot of digestive adaptations in the cecum, the small intestine, the colon, so they're considered hindgut fermenters. And the reason this is important is because it affects the amount of forage that they consume and the amount of forage they require. So if anybody's ever taken care of horses, they will know that they require an absolute amount of forage to keep them going, and they also need a lot of water to process that forage. They have a high passage rate, so they take in a lot of biomass, but they pass it through their system really fast, whereas things like cows have this huge rumen, and they take in a lot of biomass too, but they really have slow passage times. So that's one of the differences between horses and cows. If we look at it more specific to wildlife here, this is from a paper from the mid-'80s, Hoffman, and he put them into these broad categories of concentrate selectors, intermediate selectors, and grass roughage selectors. All right, so we see mule deer right in there on the left-hand side between whitetail and moose. Concentrate selectors, what that means is they require a particular type of plant and really the plant parts, so they're very selective. So they're browsing, but they're not just chomping off big chunks of sagebrush. They're really picking out individual plant parts because their digestive system is so highly selective and evolved. You look at things like elk or even bison, they're much less selective. So they can process fibrous forage like even poor quality grass, and they can still process it. They have a long digestion time, but they can process things like grasses that are dried out. I threw cattle on here just to kind of put that in perspective, much similar to like a bison in terms of their ruminant ecology. And there is a body size trend there. The one outlier is moose, and we do have moose in Nevada. They're much more selective. They're more of a browser as well. They tend to take off plant parts, so their body size doesn't quite fit the model there, but they are considered a concentrate selector, like mule deer. All right, so now this is really getting into the weeds and looking at specific characteristics of the rumen in these different categories of ruminants. On the left, we have a concentrate selector. So this is a mule. The figure shows a roe deer in Europe. It's a European publication, but it's very similar to a mule deer. They have very evolved salivary glands and large salivary glands compared to size-wise to something like a buffalo on the right-hand side. That helps them in digestion. In fact, it's required for their digestion because a lot of these browse species have a lot of tannin in them, tannins, lignin, things like lignin, volatile oils, and they have kind of this specialized system to deal with those things so they can process the forage. If you go to they have a large liver, comparatively speaking, and smaller, shorter intestine compared to an intermediate or grass roughage selector. So if we go to the middle category there, that's a red deer, which is very similar to an elk in North America. Kind of an intermediate between a grass and roughage selector and a concentrate selector. So they can process both grass and browse, and their stomachs are evolved to deal with sort of both of those. And then, again, I'm going to the right-hand side, a bulk and roughage eater. This is showing a buffalo. But really, you can categorize them as processing high-fiber food, a lot of cellulose in that plant wall, and they have these huge rumens to be able to process that forage. That allows them to subsist on poor quality range conditions. That's an important notice, whereas mule deer, as I mentioned before, require this sort of high quality diet and browse species in their diet, and things like forbs and grasses in the spring. So why is it important? For a conservation perspective, it's because habitat is a dynamic condition. It's constantly changing, right? And so mule deer are an early stage successional species. That just means that in general, they prefer plant growth at their earlier stages. I mentioned before, old things like decadent bitterbrush and sagebrush just don't have the forage quality, even though they can consume it. It doesn't have the qualities it once did. It also makes them more susceptible to changes in forage quality and quantity. So things like fires, type conversion, as I mentioned before, conversion to cheatgrass, and really old decadent browse can contribute to these changes in poor forage quality for mule deer. All right, so this is a complicated figure, and I apologize, but I'm going to walk you through it. It's a publication from Wildlife Society Bulletin, and it's describing the fat cycle in mule deer on an annual basis. They sort of have these cartoons on the right-hand side by the different seasons, and these deer are carrying a sled up the hill, okay? And the sled represents their energy demands, things like lactation and growth, and the plants represent their summer food. So that's going to kind of like determine how far up the hill they can go, right? So they need food to get up the hill, and they have all these demands on them throughout the summer. the more food they have, the higher on the hill they're going to go. Okay, that's important to note. And it's going to sort of increase their rate to get up the hill. If you kind of go down a step there into the fall, that's when the load is the least. Okay, so they're done with lactation. They've gotten the highest on their hill. They've been on this high quality diet all summer. And that's when they really have the most fat reserve. So we expect mule deer to have their best body condition in the fall. Okay, so that is important because when we get down to winter, we show these mule deer sledding down the hill, right? And that's basically their ascent to whether they're going to live and die, unfortunately. It's kind of a sadistic graph here, but if they go over the cliff, obviously they're going to die. So the higher up on the hill they go, the farther they're going to have to make it to where they're not going to slide off the cliff. And also that winter food is important because that's going to slow their rate going down the hill. So if they've got a lot of winter food, they can expect they're going to sled down. All populations of mule deer, I shouldn't say all, but most experience their highest body condition in the fall, and they almost always lose weight during the winter. That doesn't mean they're going to die, but they're probably going to lose weight. So if we go down to the bottom and then we look at spring, that's when we can expect the most amount of weight loss, the most they're going to lose throughout the year. And if they have excessive weight loss, unfortunately in this scenario they fall off the cliff and they die. And then those that make it start the cycle again on the summer. And so really summer range is about resource acquisition. It's about provisioning offspring. So that's when they're lactating, things like that. That's when resources are good. That transitions to the mating season in the fall. Winter is about forage availability, just kind of like the absolute amount of forage availability out there on the landscape. And that really slows their weight loss on this cycle. So that's what's important about winter range and winter range quality. So this is some data that I have put together. This is from a study that we started in Nevada for my PhD project. We actually went out and captured animals and we measured them. We measured their body fat levels with an ultrasound machine. We also measured their weight, measured their leg length, we measured their jaw length. We sort of put that into this index of body condition. So I'm calling it the body mass index. This is very similar to the BMI, the human body mass index. Okay, so it's not perfect, but in general what it describes is if you're tall, tall and skinny in this scenario, you're in poor condition. You're on the left-hand side of the body mass index. If you're short and fat, you're probably going to be on the higher end of the body mass index. That's a good thing for wildlife. You want to be short and fat in this scenario if you're a mule deer, because that means you're going to survive that winter condition. And so really this is scaled in relative to 0, so less than 0 is a poor body mass index, greater than 0 is a high body mass. We see several things here, difference in survival between males and females, but the important thing to note is if you're in poor condition, you can expect poor survival. And we directly measured this. Okay, so we had radio collars on the animal. We put it into a model. We estimated the actual survival rate for individuals. We look at fawn survival, it's even more pronounced. So the smaller fawns survive less than the bigger fawns. We've known that for a long time, but this kind of puts it into a perspective. We looked at males and females. The important thing to note here is that as you get an increase in body condition, we actually see that difference between males and females go away a little bit. So when all animals are fat and happy, we can expect male and female survival to be the same. All right, so this is a study that was done, a very well-known study back in the 70s by Dale McCullough. He was a professor at University of Michigan, and he wrote a whole book on this study. It was a 15-year study on white-tailed deer, and it was in an enclosure situation. And so they experimentally reduced the population down very low. There was only 10 animals, 10 adult females, when they sort of removed animals. And then they allowed the population to increase, sort of no hunting or anything like that, to a high density. And they collected, along the way, they collected very detailed data on reproduction, nutritional data, survival, and things like that. They developed these Ricker-like models of population growth and harvest. I'm going to show you some of those. So the Ricker-like model is it's a fisheries model used to describe population growth. All right, so I'm talking about density-dependent growth. I'm I promise there will not be a quiz, but you can just kind of disregard the equation for now. This is kind of a classic logistic growth curve. On the left-hand side, we have population size over time. And the dotted line there is K, that means carrying capacity, where your births equal deaths. And really the important thing to note is if you were to take a population and plink it into an unoccupied habitat like an island, for instance, that population is going to be very low when you start, but it's going to increase over time. This is not considering predation at all. This is just straight up, population growth size. We get to this inflection point where the star is, that's MSY, maximum sustained yield. That's sort of the point in the curve that really the rate of growth changes. So it's still, the population's increasing. If you look at the time, it's still increasing up towards carrying capacity, but really the rate of growth starts to slow. And the reason it was called maximum sustained yield is really these fisheries biologists were trying to figure out, the absolute amount of fish they could take out of a stock without affecting the population size. So that's why they called it the maximum sustained yield. That's when the recruitment would be the highest and they could harvest the most fish out of that population. If we look on the right-hand side, what this curve shows is the recruitment rate. So you could just think of this as observed fawn ratio. That's what we quantify for recruitment rate. It's really at its max when population size is near 0. And as you get towards carrying capacity, you can see that's just a straight linear fashion. Then the MSY is about half of that. So we could expect, all that equation says is that maximum sustained yield is about half when a population is at carrying capacity. All right, so this is just taking that curve and sort of flipping it on its angle. We have recruitment number on the y-axis. We have population size on the x-axis. K, again, carrying capacity there on the right-hand side, and MSY is about half of carrying capacity. So we see this parabolic relationship, sort of recruitment number. This is where we expect the number of recruits. So we're not just talking about producing fawns and having fawns. This is the actual number that survive to the next year to become an adult. Your maximum recruit is right there, about half your population size. The pictures kind of depict certain conditions when you might expect things to see at a low population size. Generally, the reproductive rate is high, but the population size is small. That's when you're going to see things like twins or triplets in mule deer, and even antler size is correlated to these low population size below the sort of carrying capacity value. On the right-hand side, we see poor or higher population size, but a very low reproductive rate with very young being recruited into the population. And so I'm going to talk about a little bit of mortality. We have two basic types, additive and compensatory. And all that means really is additive is when you have mortality that's added to other types of mortality. So you add everything together. An example could be sources of predation, mortality, road mortality, and harvest, all sort of additively causing animals to be removed. If we have compensatory mortality, that's when one form of mortality is sort of compensated for another. So you could think of this as instead of harvesting, we have animals just dying of starvation on the landscape. You could also swap out harvest with predation. If animals are predated upon, they're not going to starve on the landscape and vice versa. All right, so this is looking at that curve again with recruitment number on the y-axis, populations as a function of population size. And the dashed line represents what the attempted recruits are. So you can think of things like fetal rates, which tend to be high in mule deer. But the actual recruits is sort of that solid bar there. And why this is important is these are the conditions when we can expect additive mortality versus compensatory mortality. So if we're below that MSY line on the graph, you see up there in the red arrow additive mortality. That's when things like predation are going to be causing the population to move towards the lower population size, so they're additive. If you're at MSY or above, you can think of mortality as being compensatory. So if we have predation out there, it's compensating for animals that would have died anyway. Or if we have harvest out there, we're harvesting animals that throughout the population probably would not have survived on their own. So one final thing on this is, and this is a publication that I took from my graduate advisor, Terry Boyer. he sort of looked at all these conditions, all this literature, and put it together in this nice table, and it's showing the life history characteristic on the left-hand side, and these columns here on the right are when populations are at or below maximum sustained yield. So the left-hand side of that curve, or populations are near at K, above that. Nutritional condition of females, we can expect to be good when we're below MSY, poor when we're at or above carrying capacity. Things like pregnancy rate are much higher in adult females when they're below carrying capacity. Pause in annual reproduction by females, so that just means whether they have a fawn every year or every other year. Okay, so when we have good conditions in the populations at a low size, we can expect animals to have a fawn or twins every year. When conditions are poor, they might skip. They might not get bred that year and pregnant, and so they don't have a fawn. The number of yearlings, this is one thing they looked at in the George Reserve. They looked at yearlings pregnant, okay? So when we're below conditions, a lot of times yearlings get pregnant. If it's poor conditions or above carrying capacity, you can expect not too many yearlings to be pregnant. Age at first reproduction, weight of neonates, survivorship of young, all you see these trends here. The one I thought was interesting that they also looked at is they looked at tooth wear, okay? And so they saw that actually when these populations were new and introduced and below carrying capacity, that they actually saw sort of normal tooth wear, what you'd expect, wearing teeth on older animals. But when you're at K or above, you actually see a lot of excessive tooth wear on their teeth at much younger ages. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it. There's less quality forage out there for them. They're grabbing parts of the plant that they normally don't want to grab, and they're processing a lot of forage a lot more than they would normally, and they're having to digest that. So they're having to break it down, and it actually wears their teeth down quickly. They also are more likely to grab things on the ground, like dirt and things like that wear their teeth a little bit quicker. Pause again briefly if there's any questions on ruminant nutrition and how that relates to mule deer populations. All right, seeing none, I'm going to continue on. So this is a picture of that I grabbed off of my phone. Actually, I used an application that shows the hunt units, and you can actually look at fires that are ongoing. I was looking at this to look at the Sugarloaf fire right there inside of the center of the picture. But really what struck me is it shows the fire history going back to the 80s, I believe, and the red is the more recent fires. And so if you look on sort of left of that the yellow polygon, we see 2018, that big red blotch, that's the Martin fire. And really what we look at when we see this picture, this is northern Nevada. Okay, we see a lot more fires recently since 2016. But even going back to the early 2000s, which are the kind of the more translucent yellow and orange polygons, we see fires stacked on top of fires. And we really see the total area being burned very, very widespread in Nevada. And some of these larger fires that we're seeing, such as the Martin fire, such as the Sugarloaf fire, definitely have an impact on wildlife populations, particularly mule deer. So this is a photo, I believe, from the Elko Daily Free Press from the Overland fire a couple years ago. At first glance, you know, sort of a typical wildfire that we might see in the pinyon juniper band there. If we zoom in a little bit closer, we just see sort of the absolute amount of fuel being burned. Okay, so these pinyon juniper trees that you can see are about 20 to 30 feet tall. Now, I don't know what the height of those flames are, but they're really high. That's an intense burning fire right there, burning in that pinyon juniper. And the scale of these and the severity of these fires, we know through publications in science and literature, are increasing, unfortunately, in the Great Basin. So I took these photos from our Western region habitat biologists who've really been diligent getting out there on the ground, looking at assessing these fires. And if we see on the left-hand side, this is the Long Valley fire, I believe, outside of Reno. Right after the fire is the top part of the panel. So we can see a lot of burn area there, and we go down. This is 1 year post-fire after we went in and reseeded that. Now, I throw this in there just because it doesn't look like a great picture. Okay, I'll admit. this was probably what we consider a less successful restoration effort. But that is only 1 year post-fire, and unfortunately we just didn't have the moisture conditions to where this sort of post-fire recovery efforts we might expect to be more successful. It's a little bit rosier on the right-hand side. This is the photo from the Bravo fire. And this is not a before and after. This is the two from the same time period. But what we see here, this is Snowstorm Forage Kochia, 1 year after the fire. This is a slightly different aspect. This is a sort of a northwest aspect. But we really see, plant growth pretty good. And we start to see some recovery of this fire even only 1 year. So in the right conditions, in the right moisture, the right elevation, and our efforts to restore habitats, this is going to have a lot, this picture on the right-hand side is going to hold a lot more wildlife value than the one on the left. And so we can I want to put that out there because we have to have sort of these quelled expectations for what we can expect on fire recovery. Even though we do invest a lot of our own money, we work with our federal partners on fire restoration. In some cases, they just aren't successful as others. All right, so this is kind of looking at more on the data. This is a paper that I pulled from Pete Coates, who does a lot of work on sage grouse. And this is the total area burned in the Great Basin from 1984 to 2013. The red are low precipitation years, and the blue dots are high precipitation years, okay? So we can see several trends in this. First of all, just fires in general, the total area burned was much lower in the mid-80s. Compared to 2013, 2012, where we see a lot more acreage being burned. But we really see that trend between the high precipitation years and low precipitation years. I mean, this makes common sense to most people. When conditions are dry, we have the likelihood for these sort of larger areas. But really the more troubling trend in this is this sort of upward trajectory, both in low and high years, of total acreages burned in the Great Basin. So that's kind of putting data, numbers to that figure I showed from my Onyx maps that shows the distribution of fires in the Great Basin. Okay, so here's this lovely figure from the Wildlife Society Bulletin again, the mule deer sledding down a brushy hillside. And I just want to put this out there to reiterate that that's what these mule deer are using to get up the hill, to get higher on the hill, to put on fat reserves. Okay, so when you take that brush away, that brush component, they're not able to get up higher on the hill. They're not able to put on those fat reserves. And then when they're sledding back down, when they're going towards fall into winter, there's nothing there for them to hold them from going off the edge of the cliff to death, unfortunately. So that top picture is just showing immediately after a fire. I believe that was taken from the Martin fire. And this bottom picture I took showing the Argenta rim. This is many years after a fire, actually. But you see that fire scar. And you just don't see the sagebrush there in the sort of the lower part of the panel where it didn't burn. You can kind of see that contrast going up the hill. So if you just think about that in terms of those mule deer sledding on the hill, they don't have anything. They don't have that plant to slow their decline or to even get up the hill to put on those fat reserves. And that's a significant factor for mule deer populations in Nevada and west-wide. All right, so I'm going to talk about predation. We know that's a factor. I alluded to the publications there that showed that as part of the issue. In the early 2000s, Warren Ballard published this paper, and actually in collaboration with a lot of the Western agencies, they pooled together all their data. They showed sort of these different scenarios where predators can have an impact on wildlife, on prey populations. And so this is showing moose density on the y-axis, but this is kind of relates to ungulates in general. Okay, and then we have time on the x-axis. I won't go into all the details of this, but what we can kind of see is there's certain conditions when we can expect predators to hold prey populations below a certain level, and certain times, more commonly, when they're actually going to increase to their own level, to their own carrying capacity. So that dashed line in there is the vegetative carrying capacity. Okay, and I'll start with the upper right-hand corner. Low density equilibrium. This is what the authors determine where a situation, and it's actually fairly unique and rare, but it does occur, where you have moose density being regulated by predators regardless of the vegetation carrying capacity. That's what some have termed the predator pit scenario. It often occurs in landscapes where you have large and multiple predators, so things like grizzly bears, wolves, black bears, particularly in Alaska and the Yukon. If we look at some of the other scenarios, what we see is populations of prey sort of increasing up to some threshold level, and then removal of predators may allow that population to increase. But ultimately, they're going to hit that line, which is the vegetative carrying capacity. Okay, and so the important take-home message here is, yes, we can do predator control, but we have to have sort of these expectations that we cannot magically create more mule deer than what the landscape can allow them to have. Okay, and there are times when predator control can be effective under these certain scenarios. So the mule deer working group kind of put out this series of literature, fact sheets. This was the very first one, relationships among mule deer and their predators. Okay, this has been a hot topic for decades, but really it was kind of coming to a boiling point in the 90s when the mule deer working group formed. They put out together these easy to read fact sheets that kind of boil all this science down into just easy to read, kind of common sense. So they come up with these guidelines for using science to guide management. So predator control can be used when predation is identified as a limiting factor. That's an important starting point. It must be implemented when deer populations were well below their carrying capacity. The control efforts themselves have to be sufficient across the landscape to yield results. Okay, so that for a coyote population, that generally has to be about 70% of the population on a continual basis as well. Okay, you can't just do it in 1 year and expect to have results immediately after. Predator control efforts were best timed, most effective just prior to and predator and prey reproduction. Okay, so if you do these targeted approaches just before spring fawning, for instance, that's when they're the most effective. And generally, they have to be at a focused scale. So you can't just sort of blanketly apply this across wide landscapes and expect to see results. It really has to be on kind of a focused effort, less than 250 square miles. So I want to talk a little bit about predation management in Nevada. Currently, we have really only one ongoing predator project for mule deer, specifically for mule deer in Eureka County. It's called Project 40 in the current predator plan. Focused on the removal of coyotes for the protection of mule deer. I wasn't able to get the most recent data. It's of 2017. There's been about 600 coyotes removed, one mountain lion. I did ask Pat, Staff Specialist Pat Jackson, about this. There will be an update in the November commission meeting, I believe, about the status of this project with more recent numbers. But the important thing to note about this project is one of the reasons that we supported it and that was implemented is because we had the conditions where we saw these depressed reproduction from mule deer, but we also had changes on the landscape. So we did a large-scale horse removal. I say we, the BLM did a horse removal. That's going to alleviate that habitat carrying capacity a little bit. They also, Eureka County invested a lot into some of these habitat treatment projects. Okay, so they're cutting pinyon and juniper and things like that, and sort of creating habitat conditions that might be conducive to this predator project being successful. And so I just grabbed this table below here. This is out of the predator plan, conditions when we, the department, have decided that we would at least start talking about it. Really, we're looking at spring fawn to adult ratios below 35 over a several-year basis, not just on a 1-year basis. And when we see our adult annual survival below 80%, that's when we can expect mortality to be added, and we're probably the population is going to be declining. The annual growth rate is going to be declining when we have below 80% survival. All right, so I mentioned the mule deer working group. They have a great website. A lot of these publications, this literature, these fact sheets can be downloaded here. It's all kind of compiled there. They began in 1997. There's all the proceedings from the biannual workshop is posted on there. Really just a great site, but I wanted to bring, because that's where you can go to get these fact sheets. So that one I mentioned before here, relationship among mule deer and predators, kind of boils all this science down. Carrying capacity, there's a really good one on carrying capacity. How many deer can we have? It sort of lays it all out there, what I just kind of went through, but it's in a simple boiled down format. There's a bunch of them on here. This one's antler point restrictions. I'm not going to talk about that. I did present that at the Lander cab workshop last year. I think we're up to 28 of these worksheets. So, really, it's these Western state agencies, it's biologists putting these together, working with professors and things like that, sort of on our own time, oftentimes, digging through the science and putting it into these sort of simple terms. I wanted to talk briefly about Secretarial Order 3362 that was released by the Department of Interior last February. Secretary Zinke announced it in Salt Lake City, improving habitat quality in western big game winter range and migration corridors. And so really what the Secretarial Order did is a call on these states to work collaboratively with the BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, and National Park Service to prioritize winter range habitats and migration corridors for mule deer, pronghorn, and elk. So these maps below here are, we submitted, they really wanted to us to focus on 3 to 5 priority herds, and our migratory herds are in Elko County. So the left-hand map there, I apologize, it's fairly hard to read on here on the screen, but that's the Area 6 mule deer. So the pink lines are basically just the migration sequences, the lines connecting the dots. This is our collar data, our GPS collar data. We've invested highly to track these populations and their movements. The middle is Area 7, so the Pequot deer herd crossing Highway 93 and I-80 there. And then on the right-hand side, this is the Ruby Mountains. The blue lines show the bulk of the migration sequences going down in the South Ruby Butte. And so we as an agency said, look, these are our high priority corridors because that's our bulk of our migratory populations. And it's actually over half of our state population occur on these 3 herds roughly. And they are highly migratory, okay? And they have challenges. They have fencing, they have impediments, roads, mines sometimes in the corridors, and even housing development. So we put the focus on that. One of the things that the Secretarial Order did is it called for this collaborative effort, and so Nevada hosted a workshop along with our partners from the USGS. Really, the Wyoming Migration Initiative has been leading the charge on some of these more advanced mapping techniques. We teamed up with the Nevada chapter of the Wildlife Society. What this did is it provided a training, did several things actually, but it provided training for biologists to run these more advanced statistical models. So mapping corridors turns out to be a fairly sophisticated science. Yes, you can just plot the lines on a map and get the general picture. But some of these more advanced models, like this Brannigan Bridge movement model, really distills all that information and tells you where the corridors are constricted and where they're spending most of their time. So there's a whole movement out there called stopover ecology, and that turns out to be a very important thing for these mule deer. So they're not just migrating from their summer to winter range, but they're stopping over at points, they're acquiring resources, and they're spending a lot of time in stopovers, and that turns out to be highly important to their nutrition and their survival. It was also a policy forum for land management agencies, university, so we had folks from Fish and Wildlife Service there talking with state biologists. This particular one, we pooled sort of representatives from Utah, Arizona, and Wyoming really led the modeling portion of it. It was a great workshop, had a good turnout. Learned a lot of good things. So I just want to conclude. So all this information I've covered here, distilling it down so we see that mule deer populations have fluctuated widely over the past century, and really across many western states, including Nevada. Populations have experienced a downward trend in Nevada and many other states in recent decades. There's been many issues that have been identified as causal factors, things like the biggest probably being the change in habitat quality, but also fire regimes. We also know that impacts to the migration corridors, so things like oil and gas and roads that have direct sort of impacts have impacted their populations. Predation is a limiting factor in some cases. Climate change and severe drought really are some of the other key take-home messages. We learned a little bit about mule deer, hopefully learned something about digestive systems, and that really the important message is that they require this diverse. I didn't cover diversity, but turns out shrub diversity is also important. So if you had a prime stand of sagebrush out there, really what you want is a diversity of different shrubs and different age classes of shrubs. Okay, things like serviceberry, bitterbrush, forbs during the summer really also helps their nutrition. And that's all based on that plant cellulose and that crude protein. So their highly selective gut system is really more evolved for young and nutritious plant parts compared to other species. Mule deer are limited by density-dependent factors, just like a lot of other ungulates, and really that's generally what regulates population growth rate. Predation can be a limiting factor under certain conditions, and generally we only see that when populations are below K. Again, K is just representing carrying capacity. Okay, and so we can go out and measure things. We can go out and collect data on some of these observations of when populations are at or above carrying capacity. And we can expect those being borne out as poor body condition, observed reduced fawn recruitment, pauses in reproduction, and increased tooth wear at sort of these younger ages. We can go out and physically collect data on that and determine where that population is. All right, so I wanted to kind of leave on a positive note. So I know there was a lot of somewhat negativity in there, but also realism. This is a short video, and I might have to have somebody help me click on it, that Tim Terrell put together for us. We're doing a series of these public outreach videos, and our hope is to actually have a longer video. I know we're running low on time, so I put a short one in here. Doug, would you mind helping me out with the mouse? So this is footage that we have a contract photographer, Tim Terrell, is helping us out a lot with these. And you might have seen, we're actually doing public outreach commercials on TV ads, and we're hoping to get them on our website soon. But this is one of the ones that I showed that he put together. Our mule deer doing best to survive. Hopefully it plays, it might not play. Yep, it's fairly short. I like the last part of that video, so it showed that buck browsing on that bitterbrush. And that's really, when we talk about selectivity, they are very selective on particular plant parts. I just want to kind of leave that with the take-home message. So that's all I have. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you guys have for me, or go back and visit some of these if need be.
Cody, thank you very much for that. An awesome presentation. I learned a lot of things and put a lot of things together that we talk about, and different parts of different things that the commission does. So I really appreciate. I know that must have taken a lot of time to put together, but it's very informative. I guess one question I have is, and I appreciated the time and effort to get into the details of the digestion and all that. But you made the example of the horses, and horses need a lot of forage. And what I haven't seen from the professional literature is have we overlaid the population estimates of feral horses in Nevada and compared that to the mule deer? Because I hear this, and you see what you see out there when you're driving around, and it seems that the horse population is going like this. The mule deer population is going like that, and you put in all these other factors on that study, or at least overlaid those two populations, because it seems to me that's got to be one additional factor, especially in Nevada with the number of feral horses we have.
Yeah, so Commissioner Johnson, I'll take a stab at that. So, the best of my knowledge, we actually haven't done that. That probably would be an insightful exercise. I can say that, trying to keep up on the literature, this is a hot topic, and it's gaining a little more traction. There are some studies out there ongoing right now. There's been a few studies published on sort of the negative impacts of horses, wild horses on ungulate populations, mule deer in particular, and pronghorn. And where it's been kind of demonstrated is sort of like this competitive interaction, particularly around water sources. We know that, especially dry environments where there's a very limited water supply, if you've got, as you mentioned, large populations of horses sort of using these water sources, that can negatively impact mule deer and other wildlife species accessing that forage, or the water, sorry. To my knowledge, there hasn't been any published literature on the horse, just kind of these general trends in populations in mule deer. One thing of caution, though, correlation does not necessarily imply causation. So similar to what they've done this with elk before too, kind of recognizing that. But there are many cases where there are mule deer populations declining where there are very few horses as well. So we have to be, it's a valid point, but we have to be cautionary on that as well of implying correlation.
Right, I understand that correlation is not causation, but I would really like to see, we take these population estimates of mule deer in Nevada, put them on the graph over years, look at what population counts or estimates are with the horses, and then you have another dotted line that is appropriate management level statewide that's been set, and what's the excess? I mean, I'd really like to see that, and it's not so much to say that's the cause. I think there's a lot of causes, and you noted a lot of them here, but it just seems as we go through this, it's the one component when we know there is, as you know, this, as you just noted, this competition issue on scarce water sources and others. And I understand the dilemma that the whole horse issue brings up, both from who has the ability to manage those, the political issues and the legal challenges and all that, but it's something I'd really like to see in the future.
I think to add to that, I think you're probably going to see a little bit more science and literature coming out that in the next coming years. I know there's some researchers at USGS kind of working on similar things, but it may take a few years.
But again, it was just a great presentation. I learned so much in that hour or 15 minutes, however long it took, went by very, very quickly, because I think you took it at the right level, enough detail, and I really appreciate, I'm glad we had this agenda item. Commissioner Barnes.
Thanks, Cody. Just a quick comment, and I really appreciated the presentation. I really enjoyed it. I think it just proves that maybe we need to focus our range management more on our uplands. It seems like since the early 90s, we were so focused on the riparian right along the creeks that we forgot that there are some uplands and there are some species that depend on those uplands. So I think looking at this presentation, just kind of brought to light that, you know, there's more to range management than just riparian. We need to look at the whole range system. And so thank you.
Absolutely.
Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Cody. Yeah, I feel like, you know, I've said it a number of times that I'd seen the presentation that Tony had put together several times, and every time I saw it, it was a little different. I feel like I haven't even seen anything again. You know, after that, it's like, okay, wow, I'm back to square one. Your last pictures where you were showing the fires burning through the pinyon juniper, the pinyon habitat there. So in some of the you know, I've been running along with the impression and that mule deer depended on this landscape scale disturbance, and that's why some of those numbers went up. So I'm sitting here and I'm thinking to myself, you know, with these fires, we're getting this massive landscape scale disturbance. Is there anything to look forward to? Or we've got these other challenges that have hit in the last 20, 30 years that are going to override that? You see where I'm headed with that?
Commissioner McNish, if I may. Yeah, that's a great point, and I did gloss over this, and I probably put a little too much of a negative spin on fires because we do see these impacts on our winter ranges and things like that. But it actually is a good point, and I definitely glossed over this. But fire has long been considered good for mule deer. Okay, so it does reset the successional stage, and in the appropriate, in fact, most states do prescribe fire treatments for mule deer to improve the forage quality of mule deer habitat, because it does reset that successional stage. It's a disturbance, and you are correct that deer are a disturbance species. They thrive after disturbances. I wish we could use fire as a management tool more. Unfortunately, we have this sort of complicating factor in Nevada where we have the cheatgrass invasion, and just some of our forests in general have these high fuel loads there at that late phase PJ, and just the thought of using fire as a management tool or even allowing them to burn. Land management agencies have their hands tied as well. You know, they're going to fight these fires to try to get them out because of the massive scale that we're seeing them at. So we are in this sort of conundrum where it would be nice to allow fires to burn, and fires above 7,000 to 8,000 feet in Nevada in the long term are very, very beneficial for mule deer. You are definitely correct on that. And so what I presented was more of these sort of lower range, lower elevation, low precip zones where we see this cheatgrass invading. That's really what we're kind of more worried about with the wildfire. And to Commissioner Barnes's point, we should be thinking about some of these upper elevations, and that really is where mule deer put on a lot of their nutrition in the summer, and that things like fire can improve conditions like that. Unfortunately, it's just this management conundrum we're in where we have fires, we have cheatgrass, we have large fires, and they burn on a massive scale. And we spend a lot of money restoring some of that lower elevation stuff, which is important for mule deer as well, but it's a point well taken.
Right.
And I did gloss over that a little bit.
Well, you didn't. I wasn't trying to point that out. I appreciate the conversation because they're devastating right now. And I do appreciate Commissioner Barnes' comments on the, we really do have to look at these things in a different way. And I will say, I've understood that mule deer are selective, but your presentation really drove that home in a different way, and just how sensitive they really are to change, and just how very specific they are, and how their habits kind of picky, and they got a lot of working against them. But I appreciate it. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Any additional questions? All right, Director Wasley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I kind of anticipated a question on where next. What does all this mean? We have all this insight, we have all this information, and Cody did an excellent job of putting it all together in a really succinct way. So I kind of anticipated a question, if not from the commission, maybe some of the cabs or other interested public. So you have all this information, what are you going to do? I would like to maybe take advantage of this opportunity to kind of just advance perhaps an idea. Many states have launched mule deer initiatives, something similar to that. We've had some discussions internally at the department about what can we do, what kind of concentrated, focused effort can we do to address some of these identified limiting factors. Certainly we're doing a lot of that already, but there's probably some additional resources that can be brought to bear, some additional conversations in the political arena that can be brought to bear, and then highlighting awareness. We talked about the sagebrush ecosystem getting some much needed respect, talking about focusing more in some of the upland areas. We've also had a growing principle in our heritage account, and that account is a non-executive account that the commission has responsibility for distributing those funds to specific projects. I think there may be some opportunity to look at amending some of the language in the statute surrounding the use of those funds to allow maybe some of that principle to be used specifically consistent with the enabling language that created the heritage account. There may be some opportunity to reduce that almost $9 million at this point, and that principle is protected commission is able to distribute the interest that's earned on that principal and up to 75% of the current year's proceeds of those auction tags. We think there may be an opportunity to use that as a source, as a resource to address some of these identified limiting factors in a way that could allow us to be more effective in addressing some of these limiting factors. It could be specific to mule deer. It could be more broad. It could include other species. We also have the secretarial order that Cody mentioned. We are having Department of Interior and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service make funds available to better delineate these corridors and these important stopover areas. So through that research and through that delineation, if we have the ability to rehab those areas, protect these important areas through things like green stripping, be more strategic in our fire rehab efforts with additional resources. So I just want to put that out there. It's a conversation, as I said, we've had internally. I've had just minimal conversations with the governor's staff about this possibility. I know I've had a conversation with several different sportsmen's groups, both sides of the aisle in the state legislature, and there seems to be, at least at this point, some appetite to look at the possibilities to free up some of that existing $9 million principal to address some of these identified limiting factors. So just wanted to make the commission aware of that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Wasley. Any further comments? Commissioner Hubbs?
Just in terms of some of the scale of some of these fires, and I'm just lost. There was a lot of fires in Northern California area, and obviously Utah and Nevada. And is there anything from the federal level in terms of the state? It was interesting to see that the Department of Interior was interested in migration and looking at states collectively, working collaboratively to make sure that these migration corridors stay intact. But it doesn't seem like there's an approach to the fires and like a methodology to counter the intensity of some of the fires moving forward. And I just don't really hear of any type of plan or a way that we could mitigate or even terminate the fires in a more expedited manner so they don't get to be as large as they have been in the past.
So I'll take a stab at that real quick. I mean, that's a fair point and a good question. You know, you mentioned Northern California. I think it's helpful maybe to put it into context of habitat type. So some of these massive fires that we've seen in coniferous forests, say California, there are efforts out there, I know, from the federal level to try to work with, you know, agencies and land managements to sort of thin forest, if you will, to try to reduce that fuel load. That really is not as much of an option for range fires in Nevada. There are some efforts out there, things like green stripping, to try to prevent, you know, the spread of these massive wildfires. But it's a fair point that there probably is not a coordinated effort from a national level that I'm aware of to sort of combat this issue. And really, the land managers have their hands tied too, because they're dealing with budgets. These fires take massive amount of resources to fight, and so then we start running up against budgets and how do we prioritize. There's a lot of effort on sage grouse, for instance, to identify priority sage grouse habitats to try to throw the resources at them to protect those areas. Mule deer have not got that attention because, at least in the Great Basin, as much because, you know, from a sensitive species standpoint, you know, sage grouse are kind of taking that a lead a little bit. But it's a fair point, but I'm not sure, given climate change and given where we're at from the last 100 years of suppressing fires, it's a difficult challenge to overcome. I don't know if Tony has something to add.
Yeah, I guess, you know, as far as the approach, I think it's important to acknowledge that I believe it's 95% or more of the fires are stopped at a very small size. It might even be as high as 99%. It's that 1% that gets above that 1,000-acre threshold. And and unfortunately some, 450,000 acres or 237,000 acres. But this is what a lot of the ecologists have been telling us for a long time that we would see, not only due to climate change, but due to fuel conditions. When I say fuel conditions, they're talking about the woody fuels. And as carbon levels have increased, there's been a huge competitive advantage given to pinyon and juniper, for example. There's over 3 times the amount of pinyon and juniper woodlands in the Great Basin as existed pre-European man's civilization in the West. And that is very correlated and attributable to CO2 levels. So as CO2 levels have risen and pinyon and juniper have expanded, and there's more and more fuel in that woody material, and that's what we saw in the Martin Fire in the Owyhee Desert. There were certainly areas of cheatgrass around that, but there was a continuous woody material that carried that fire. There may be some opportunities to green strip, use fire-resistant, fire-tolerant vegetation strategically to protect some of that. But Martin Fire crossed 10 different fuel breaks interior, and those were fuel breaks that were probably in need of some maintenance. They probably hadn't been maintained in a number of years, and now we're learning that those fuel breaks need to be upwards of 1,000 feet wide plus to be effective in these fires. And to Commissioner McNitch's point about disturbance, I think it's important to note that a disturbance today wouldn't equal the same result as a disturbance 100 years ago, and as Cody pointed out, largely due to the presence of cheatgrass, but also CO2 levels and drought and climate change also affect the result, post-disturbance result.
Anything further? Thank you again, Cody. Why don't we take a break till 10:30, then we can reconvene at that time. If everyone could find their seats, we can resume the meeting. Alabama does kick off at 12:30. Well, that's right. There is roll tide. There is another Alabama graduate in the room. Everybody ready to go? Right, we'll move on to item 16B, tag allocation application hunt committee report. Committee Chairman Johnston. A report we provided on the committee's recent meeting. The tag allocation and application hunt committee met yesterday morning prior to the commission meeting. And it didn't seem like it had actually been that long, but the committee actually hadn't met since 2016. Or the end of 2016. And there was a number of things that came from the committee to the commission that the commission worked through in terms of waiting periods, PIW, order of draw. And as we worked through those at the commission level, then we were going to get back to the TAC committee, put things on hold a little bit to give NDAL staff time to get through the license simplification. And so a lot of the reasons why that committee took a break as it did was staff was focused, rightfully so, on the license simplification, and we wanted to get through that and then resume the TAC committee meetings. And it was also a good thing that we did so because there is now some cleanup to be done in the administrative code as a result of the license simplification. It's a lot of just cleanup language in that to make everything consistent with all the changes that have occurred. So one of the things that we did go through is a draft regulation or cleanup of many, many administrative code sections. That'll be coming forward to the commission on a future agenda. So Secretary Walls might want to make note of that. The other thing that we'll be bringing to the commission is to consider the ability of non-residents and residents to apply for bonus points if a hunt may be closed. For example, I believe right now this came up with the Rocky Mountain Bighorn. There is no non-resident tag, but there was the idea that some non-residents say, well, can I at least buy a bonus point? That way, if it does open up to a non-resident, I've built up my bonus points. And there was positive feedback for that. The one thing we decided, though, that if you did that and it was closed, that you would not lose your bonus points that you built up. In other words, we're not going to make people buy bonus points when it's closed for fear of losing them. So we'll be bringing details of that to the commission for its consideration. The other thing that we're going to bring forward to the commission for consideration has been on the TAC topic list, and we finally ironed out some of the details, was to make sure that if active military personnel are deployed, they miss the draw for obvious reasons. They have more other things on their mind. They're not focused on putting in for big game things. They would not lose their bonus points and could get them restored when they return from duty. And so we'll be bringing that. It's an accommodation. I don't know how often it would occur, but certainly an accommodation I think that can be made and should be made ultimately for that scenario where someone's deployed overseas for a couple of years and they lose their bonus points and come home. As far as new issues to consider, there's really two main issues that the TAC is going to have to try to address. One is the recurring issue of the ability to potentially transfer big game tags. And various proposals come in the form of a novice hunter or a new hunter being able to fill someone else's tag. If there's a medical issue in a family and the tag holder cannot, could they transfer it to a member of the immediate family? So there's a lot of issues that come up with that. Another was potentially being able to donate a tag to a nonprofit organization or something like that. So we're going to look at those issues. My recollection, though, is as we consider those issues, is that Nevada statute rather than Nevada administrative code precludes the transfer of tags, but we'll take a look at those issues. The other one is the youth hunts, junior hunting in general, expanding potentially youth tags, and a novice or apprentice hunter type program. Those have come from various sources. Also, CAB, particularly White Pine, have noted that. We took off of the TAC topic list a number of landowner tag issues that had been lingering on that. I will forward those to whoever serves on the landowner compensation tag committee. Some other issues was potentially being able to return your hunting license if you're not going to use it. Something comes up. I don't know how often that does, if it's in particular periods of time. And then now, given what we have, is to extend the time in which you could apply for bonus points. I think it's 1 week now after the second draw. Maybe extending that out to give people a little more time to do that. So that was about it for the TAC committee. We have, I think, narrowed down the TAC topic list once again to the point where we really only have a handful of issues. But then again, as the committee continues to meet, we oftentimes get more and more input from members of the public, the county advisory boards, and the department for new things to look at. So we'll continue to do that and going forward. I don't know if any other members of the committee have anything to add. Okay, that will close agenda item 16B. We can move on to Director Wasley's favorite item, the department activity report. Director Wasley will provide a report on recent department activities. Director Wasley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This report will be brief relative to Cody's presentation. First, from the Director's Office, Commission General Regulation 474 trap registration was approved by the Legislative Commission and was effective on August 30th, so roughly 3 weeks ago. The regulation revises provisions relating to the registration of traps as mandated by Senate Bill 364 of the 79th legislative session. SB 364 states that with certain exceptions, each trap, snare, or similar device used by a person in the taking of wild mammals must be registered with the department before it is used. It also states that for each trap, snare, or similar device registered with the department, the person registering the device shall pay a registration fee of $5. This proposed regulation provides a mechanism for the department. It's no longer proposed. This approved regulation provides a mechanism for the department to register traps and charge $5 per trap registered. The department had a significant presence at the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies conference in Tampa, Florida. During the conference, several resolutions were adopted. Mr. Chairman, you'll see next on our agenda is the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies conference report. If I may kind of include that report in the department activity report, I'd like to do so. The resolutions that were adopted included a Fish and Wildlife Agency relevancy resolution. As Commissioner McNitch pointed to yesterday, the Blue Ribbon panel had two recommendations. One was to find permanent funding for implementation of state wildlife action plans. The second one was pertaining to relevancy. I'll share with you some of the therefore statements from those resolutions. The Fish and Wildlife Agency relevancy resolution simply states that therefore be it resolved that the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies requests and fully supports the Blue Ribbon Panel Relevancy Working Group, assembling a diverse team of individuals to develop a draft roadmap by March of 2019 that would help member organizations share successful strategies and help identify and break down barriers to engaging and serving all constituents. was a resolution in support of the AFWA best management practices for the prevention, surveillance, and management of chronic wasting disease. As the Commission has heard a report on recently, the issues and concerns around chronic wasting disease continue to grow. Prevalence rates are much higher in those affected states, and there's been a recent example of chronic wasting disease crossing a species barrier. So this, it seems that there's some people have kind of grown numb to CWD or chronic wasting disease arguments. However, those that are involved in it, immersed in it, are quite concerned with prevalence rates and some of the challenges. Some of the science, as I believe Game Division Administrator Wakeling shared with us, that this is not a virus, it's not a bacteria, it's a protein, and it's a protein that can exist in the soil. It's picked up by plant material. It can exist in grain crops, including corn, and so it presents a significant challenge. I'll also share with you that we're working with our friends at the Department of Ag in amending one of their chapters pertaining to the importation of possibly infected material from states, from any state, whether that state has been identified as having high prevalence rates or not. Our neighbors to the west, California and Oregon, already have importation bans. We heard from, I believe, Chief Warden Turnipseed that he's noted, as a field warden in Winnemucca, noted an increased prevalence of dumping of carcasses in and around off-ramps, on-ramps. Last year, there was a hunter who returned either from Colorado or Wyoming to his home state of Oregon. Tests subsequently found the animal that he harvested was infected. He was notified. He took that animal out and dumped it. So again, we're talking about, it's not a normal pathogen. It's a protein. He dumped that out in the forest. That animal, the remains of that animal were located, found, and disposed of properly. Idaho recently passed a regulation. Their commission recently passed a regulation with a similar importation ban that Nevada is pursuing through the Department of Ag. That we'll hear more about that this upcoming legislative session. There's also a resolution passed on to continue the funding for the Council to Advance Hunting and Shooting Sports through the year 2020. There's a resolution passed, partnership resolution between the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and the Diversity Joint Venture, and a resolution to encourage participation by the association members in the 2019 Joint Conference of the American Fishery Society and the Wildlife Society. The relevance of that to us is that that is the first ever joint conference of the American Fishery Society and the Wildlife Society, and is expected to have in excess of 5,000 attendees, and that is being held in Reno. So it's an exciting opportunity to showcase some of what Nevada has to a significant number of wildlife professionals, and may have as many as 7,000 individuals there. And the final resolution that was passed pertained to fish and wildlife conservation at landscape scales. I know I've been involved with this effort since its inception, and really this is about collaborative landscape scale conservation activities, working with private landowners, working with NGOs, federal agencies, state agencies, in a collaborative landscape approach. So those resolutions really represent a lot of the meetings, a lot of the discussions, a lot of the issues that were around the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agency meeting last week. So that'll kind of cover that item on the agenda. In the Director's Office, we also continue to track wildlife-related bill draft requests. A lot of them simply a title. There's a lot that we don't know about those, but we are seeing a significant number of wildlife-related BDRs. The 2020 through 2021 biennial budget was submitted on time for the upcoming 2019 legislative session. The department hosted the WAFWA's Conservation Business Managers Association Conference September 17th through the 20th at Harris Lake Tahoe, and as indicated by a couple previous speakers, there were 26 states in attendance. The recent Smith-Moldy lawsuit ended in a summary judgment The judge weighed the evidence and ruled on the case before trial in the department's favor. The court clarified that its review would be limited to whether the regulation was within the statutory authority granted to the commission and found that the regulation was valid. Certainly, we have a litigation report coming up next on the agenda, and I'm assuming that Dag Stockton will correct me if I've misrepresented that. On September 12, 2018, the House passed H.R. 2591, the Pittman-Robertson Fund Modernization Bill. This bill would increase flexibility for state wildlife agencies by allowing the use of PR funds for the recruitment of hunters and recreational shooters. This added flexibility is critical to ensuring the long-term viability of revenue sources that fund state-based fish and wildlife conservation across the country. There's a Senate companion bill that currently awaits a hearing in the Environment and Public Works Committee. Basically what this bill would allow for is states, the House version anyway, would allow for states receiving Pittman-Robertson appropriations to use up to 25% of that previous year's appropriation to be used in retention, recruitment, reactivation, and education arenas. In the game division, on August 18th, an El Arrow Bell Jet Ranger on contract with the department and carrying game biologists Jeremy Lutz and Matt Jeffress crashed about 15 miles north of Battle Mountain while conducting chukar surveys. Thankfully, both biologists and the contract pilot survived and are recovering. Both the Federal Aviation Administration and the National Transportation Safety Board are investigating the accident, and the department has limited information regarding any details. Additional information will become available after the investigations are completed. The botulism outbreak at Carson Lake continues to linger. The current mortality has reached in excess of 8,000 waterfowl and shorebirds. Multiple divisions within the department and staff from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are working on monitoring, removing dead birds, and rehabilitating surviving birds in a makeshift duck hospital where food and fresh water are provided. Volunteers from the Greenhead Hunt Club, several rehabilitation clinics, students at the University of Nevada, Reno, and local residents continue to support the effort. Challenges remain due to high daytime temperatures, the inability to introduce sufficient fresh water, damaged levees that direct and regulate water distribution, and retreating water levels make the management of the outbreak difficult. Game habitat and conservation education staff participated in an aerial water haul in the volcanic hills to recharge both the Rob and Becco guzzlers. 82 buckets were dropped between the Rob and Becco guzzlers over the 2-day period. Each bucket hauled between 180 to 210 gallons. Water was obtained from the Grefco mine. Conservation education staff captured the process on film and conducted interviews with game and habitat staff. The department is currently working with Bureau of Land Management for approval to rebuild 2 guzzlers and build another in central Nevada. The National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, compliance will be completed in the upcoming weeks, and the construction should begin in spring or early summer. These projects should limit the need for water hauls in the future by expanding the capacity of existing guzzlers. Experimental approach to verifying bighorn sheep population estimates from models is being investigated in Unit 212. Because of the number of marked bighorn sheep on Lone Mountain, Game Division staff will explore a marked recite aerial survey. Game Division staff has coordinated with the University of Nevada, Reno graduate student on data locations that will be recorded every 30 minutes prior to and during the survey flight so that observations made be coordinated after the survey. This is an experimental approach that may be used for up to 2 years. The department has received photos of 2 apparent wolves in northern Washoe County from late August. The color variations indicate more than a single wolf. One may be the same that we received in November of 16. Game Division Conservation Education and Law Enforcement staff hosted seminars on hunting pronghorn, bighorn sheep, and black bears. Each event is popular and well attended. The focus of these seminars are ecology, management programs, laws, and ethical hunting scenarios. Game Division staff attended the International Deer Biology Congress in Estes Park, Colorado during August 5th through the 9th. Staff Specialist Schroeder presented an interim analysis of mule deer survival rates in Nevada in relation to body condition, migration status, and human disturbances. From the Fisheries Division, The new James Kinney Community Fishing Pond in Winnemucca is scheduled to open to the public on October 13th. We've stocked the pond with bluegill and largemouth bass in anticipation of the opening day events. The aquatic invasive species decontamination units maintained by the National Park Service at Lake Mead are back online, and NDOW crews are continuing to see a high number of watercraft inspections and decontaminations. In the last 2 weeks, staff inspected almost 800 vessels and completed 24 full boat decontaminations, plus 1 float plane. Most northern Nevada stations will close at the end of September, but crews are still busy with 362 vessel inspections completed. As a result of extended, very warm temperatures and a complete lack of rain, we've seen several incidents of toxic algae blooms in waters in the northern part of the state. Chimney Reservoir in Humboldt County was closed to water contact by the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection and the Division of Health because of very high levels of microcystis algae. Monitoring is being done weekly, and the reservoir will be reopened when NDEP indicates algae levels are safe. California also posted a warning on Topaz Lake for anatoxin A, but this was very low level and there were no use restrictions. Sampling by NDEP on the Nevada side of Topaz found no problems. In mid-August, anglers reported a large number of dead trout in the Colorado River near Laughlin. After some investigation, we learned that Bullhead City had stocked approximately 80,000 fingerling trout, allegedly for caddisfly control. The state of Arizona had issued them a permit, but Nevada Department of Wildlife was not notified. In August, the outlet valve for Knott Creek Reservoir broke in the open position when the ranch manager was testing it. We were able to work with the landowner and the Division of Water Resources to make an emergency repair, and the dam is now operational, but the reservoir lost several feet of storage. Last weekend, I was notified that we've been awarded a competitive state wildlife grant for conservation implementation for the relic leopard frog in Clark County. The frog was determined to be not warranted for an Endangered Species Act listing by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service last year, and continued conservation is critical to prevent efforts to relist the frog. The grants are awarded in a national level competition. Semi-annual surveys for the endangered Moapa dace in the Upper Muddy River were completed in late August. The count was 1,519 and nearly identical to the count last August, which indicates some stability in the populations and that ongoing efforts to improve and secure dace habitat in the Muddy River headwaters are showing success. From the Law Enforcement Division, on September 12th, Western Region Game Wardens went to Round Hill Pines for the scenario presentation that the District Attorney requested. The class went very well. The Conservation Education Division took pictures and video of the entire presentation. The district attorneys that showed up were very interested in the presentation and actively participated and asked many questions. Along with patrolling several ongoing hunts, Eastern Region Game Wardens are investigating several cases, which include several deer allegedly being shot illegally in Area 7, one of trophy quality, several cow elk that were allegedly shot illegally in Area 072, 2 were left to rot, an Area 10 case where a person shot a deer with a rifle instead of a muzzleloader, an Area 11 case where 2 antelope doe were killed illegally. The individuals were arrested in Lincoln County for unlawful possession of illegally taken antelope. An Area 081 deer case where a trophy deer was harvested illegally by an Idaho archery hunter. An Eastern Region Game Warden also assisted in the prosecution of a Winnemucca man for obstructing a game warden while investigating an overlimit of fish. The Unit Watch project was also slated for this last weekend in the Eastern Region. In the Southern Region, game wardens conducted a boat accident investigation about an overturned sailboat with a missing and presumed deceased operator on Lake Mead. The operator is still missing following extensive searches being conducted by the National Park Service. The investigation is ongoing. The game warden on Lake Mead investigated a sunken vessel near Colville Bay Marina and an explosion on a vessel at the fuel dock at the Las Vegas Boat Harbor. There was a fatal vessel collision on the Colorado River near Laughlin, which was investigated by Southern Region Game Wardens as well. A roadside stop resulting in identification of 2 illegally harvested antelope and resulting with 3 arrests in Lincoln County is being investigated by a game warden in Panaca. Southern Region Game Wardens are also conducting an investigation into harassment of wildlife and hunters in the field by an airplane. cooperation with many Nevada agencies and federal agencies on a marijuana grow takedown operation. State wildlife and land use violation charges are currently being considered by a game warden in Panaca. Game warden is investigating a failure to pursue and wanton waste on an archery deer hunt. The Southern Region Game Wardens followed up on a wakeboarder incident taken by National Park Service, resulting in a vessel collision investigation for a broken femur. Southern Region has had 4 boat accidents involving broken femurs this year that have been investigated by game wardens. The 5th may have occurred this past weekend with a kiteboarder investigated by the National Park Service. This is an oddly exaggerated number of this type of injury over other years where fewer of these types of injuries are typically seen. Game Warden Brady Phillips has been promoted to fill the Southern Region Game Warden Lieutenant position in Las Vegas. From the Conservation Education Division, it's been a busy month for the Con Ed staff. The media featured conservation education staff in avian botulism rehabilitation efforts, wildlife bypass project on Interstate 11, wildland fires, boating accidents, bear awareness, educational stories, and mountain lion sighting segments. Media outlets include Lake Tahoe Television, Nevada Public Radio, News Talk KOH, Reno News and Review, the Record Courier, channels 2, 4, and 8 in Reno, the Reno Gazette Journal, and Southern Region media as well. Community outreach efforts addressing the botulism outbreak within the Truckee Meadows have been a high priority, and conservation education staff has sent out several press releases and has continued to coordinate volunteer efforts. On social media, the conservation education staff is starting a weekly video series offering tips about living with wildlife and other NDOW programs. The series is very new with only 2 videos produced so far. 2 of NDOW's Wildlife Wednesday video series reached almost 50,000 views. The first featured bighorn sheep at Hemingway Park and made more than 82,000 impressions and was shared almost 500 times. The second featured a hunter, Lizzie Pritchett, who took part in the Nevada Outdoorsman and Wheelchair event. It made almost 60,000 impressions and was shared almost 200 times. A company called U.S. Outdoors is working with the conservation education staff on a partnership in which videos produced by NDOW will be featured on an outdoor channel that can be viewed on a Roku device. Conservation Education cooperated with state, local, federal, and private agencies during the Sheep Creek fire by participating in conference calls, arranging communication between stakeholders and representing NDOW during a community meeting, which was well received by both command staff and the general public. South Sugarloaf fire closures impacted hunt units 061, 062, 071, and 072 due to the safety issues surrounding the fire. The Small Game Hunting Guide was successfully produced and available online and in stores statewide prior to the opening day. Conservation education staff partnered with Nevada State Parks during the governor's ribbon cutting ceremony at Pitchfork State Park. The ceremony symbolized the opening of Nevada's newest state park. Conservation education staff conducted education programs throughout the day. Today, Saturday out there, we will be at Pitchfork State Park for the grand opening. Conservation education staff will have fishing, archery, and a skulls and hides education program for the public to enjoy. Today, staff will be teaching a youth waterfowl clinic at Mason Valley. Ducks Unlimited will be in attendance and will have plenty of prizes for the young hunters. Conservation education staff have continued their efforts to introduce residents to Nevada's wildlife resources and associated recreational opportunities. Education events have included wildlife hikes in the Spring Mountains, fishing and fly tying workshops, a basic archery instructor class, and introductory muzzleloader class. A waterfowl hunting seminar that covered hunting tactics, regulations, and ethics, shotgun performance, waterfowl identification, and hunting opportunities in the southern region was also a big success. Plans continue for the Ducks and Donuts event associated with the October youth waterfowl hunt at the Overton Wildlife Management Area. From the Habitat Division, construction has started on the Overton Wildlife Management Area Wetland Enhancement Project. We're working with Ducks Unlimited and Eagle View contractors on leveling Pintail and Wilson ponds to improve waterfowl habitat. The project will also upgrade water delivery and drainage structures, along with improving access for hunters. The project is expected to be completed prior to the waterfowl opener on October 27th. NDOW staff, along with Eagle Lake Bureau of Land Management, recently slung approximately 10,500 linear feet worth of fencing materials and troughs to 13 different spring sites in the Buffalo Hills. These springs are highly valuable to a host of wildlife species, most notably greater sage-grouse, mule deer, and antelope. BLM and NDOW have completed work at Porcupine and Wilcox Springs and are approximately 70% complete at Horse Spring. Work will continue over the next couple of years to complete all 13 projects. Post-construction monitoring started last month of the Boulder City bypass portion of Interstate 11 to see how desert bighorn sheep respond to the dedicated overpass and multiple underpasses. One goal of the study underway will look at human activity on the overpass and how those disturbances impact use by bighorn sheep and other wildlife. From the Data and Technology Services Division, Department of Wildlife License Office is working to support tag returns and alternate hunters getting into the field. We've been working closely with the Conservation Education Division to keep hunters informed of the changing fire conditions and related public lands impacts. License Office had also been working closely with law enforcement to implement the new trap registration regulation recently approved by the Legislative Commission. We expect to have the new trap registration tags available by the opening day of trapping season, before the opening day of trapping season, which is on October 1st. GIS staff demonstrated a prototype of the new wildlife data management system we've been developing. Hope to release a version to the department biologists this spring as we move into a more robust testing phase of the project. The system will house and manage all of the wildlife observation, capture, and tracking data the department collects for our various projects and management objectives. In the Wildlife Diversity Division, wildlife diversity biologists spent 8 days surveying the Carson and Truckee River watersheds in August and September for pond turtles using 20 new traps that were purchased for NDOW by the Nature Conservancy. We had participants from state, federal, and private agencies, as well as volunteers. We successfully captured and obtained genetic samples from 20 western pond turtles in the Carson River watershed. We now have a total of 47 genetic samples covering 27 river miles in the Carson Valley. We're unsuccessful in capturing turtles on the Truckee River, but we'll be continuing to survey in September and October in order to obtain additional samples for an in-depth genetic analysis of western pond turtles in Nevada. And I will also be attending an interagency coordination meeting in Sacramento with attendance from various agencies, university researchers, and additional conservation partners. The department, along with agency partners and volunteers, has been conducting winter raptor surveys for more than 20 years. Last year, we contracted with Intermountain Bird Observatory at Boise State University to conduct an in-depth data analysis and provide recommendations on ways to improve our survey methods. The final report, including a webinar, was provided to the department this past August, and some interesting results about birds of prey wintering in Nevada include bald eagles appear to have a stable or slightly increasing population over the long term in Nevada. Golden eagles show population growth in recent years and a fairly stable population over recent decades. Many raptor species exhibit what appears to be a cyclical pattern, with density estimates cycling every 3 to 6 years, probably based on prey cycles. For 7 species of raptors, there was a positive correlation with cropland. Bald eagles and peregrine falcons were largely aligned with habitat related to large reservoirs. Only golden eagles showed no strong response to either cropland or lakes. 3 species, including Cooper's hawks, red-tailed hawks, and kestrels, showed moderate levels of association with developed areas, while the majority of other analyzed species showed strong negative association with all levels of development. That, Mr. Chairman, concludes my brief report.
Thank you, Director Rosley. Any questions? With that, move to the next agenda item, which is 16D, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies Conference Report. To the extent you have anything to add beyond what you included in the department activity report.
I don't believe so, Mr. Chairman. I think that through our discussion and presentations yesterday on the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, through the discussion and presentation of the resolutions that were passed, I think that largely captures the majority of issues, the primary issues of discussion and concern covered at that meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Move on to the next agenda item, litigation report. Deputy Attorney General Brian Stockton, a status report on litigation will be provided. Deputy Attorney General Stockton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My report will be brief compared to Director Wasley. So I just have a few updates to the report. On number 2, which is the United States versus Truckee Carson Irrigation District, they did have a change of judge to Judge Miranda Dew has assumed responsibility for that case. On number 3, which is the Walker River and the Mineral County portion, the Nevada Supreme Court did accept the second certified question, which is whether if the state decides to rededicate water rights to public trust uses, is that a taking of the vested water rights under Nevada water law? On number 4, which is the Smith-Moldy that Director Wasley mentioned, he's correct. The summary judgment was granted. However, there was a motion to reconsider filed the next week, and that's still pending. On number 6, which is the Nevada Wildlife Alliance, that's challenging the 80% rule on predator fees. The motion to dismiss briefing has been completed and it has been submitted to the court for decision. And on number 8, Ridgetop Holdings, we did get the final dismissal of that case, which that's the California case that was filed in Nevada City, and the plaintiffs agreed to dismiss that one, and so that one's been finally dismissed. And with that, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay, move on to agenda item number 17, Nevada Department of Wildlife Project Update, Secretary Tony Wasley. The Commission has requested the Department provide regular project updates for ongoing projects and programs as appropriate based on geography and timing of meetings. These updates are intended to provide detail in addition to summaries provided as part of the regular Department report and are intended to inform the Commission and public as to the Department's ongoing duties and responsibilities.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have 2 reports to share with you today. One will be a relatively brief report, an update on this year's fire season. Habitat Division Administrator Alan Janae isn't here today. Mr. Wakeling will present that. I believe there may be 4 slides. Excuse me. Just updating the presentation that we had at our previous meeting, and we'll continue to keep, as long as we have issues to report surrounding fires, we'll keep that as part of this standing agenda item. I think there was, the second report we'll have today is pertaining to some of the cave exploration activities and some of the findings in those caves. There was a expressed desire by this commission to hear a report on some of those activities. I'd also like to put on your radar at this point, as we're listening to these presentations, recall we will be back north in November, and if there are some timing appropriate or geographically relevant subjects that you would like before this commission in this similar format, please make note of that and share that with me when we're discussing future agenda items, and we'll make sure that is included and we're prepared to provide that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Wakeling to provide an update on our fire season.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Director. Brian Wakeling, Game Division Administrator. Habitat Division Administrator Janae and Habitat Staff Specialist Lee Turner developed a short presentation, kind of an update on where we are with fires for the current fiscal year. And I'm going to try to get, that was the wrong button, wasn't it? There we go. So just to give you a real quick overview of since the last meeting where Administrator Janae kind of gave an update, currently, you know, we've got quite a few fires, and that doesn't come to any surprise to anybody that's been kind of paying attention to some of the information that you see on the news. When you look at the frequency, and again, just as Alan Janae had pointed out, not trying to have you look at every single line on this slide, but just to indicate just how many different fires are actually occurring. And then just a real quick breakdown on them. 135 of them have been over 5 acres in size, 33 over 1,000 acres. 9 of the fires have been over 10,000 acres, and 3 fires have been over 1,000. It's kind of astounding when you start looking at how much is actually going. When you look at the distribution of the fires around Nevada, we haven't seen an awful lot occurring within the southern portion. Most of them have occurred either in the western and predominantly in the eastern, and those are the ones we're going to kind of focus on here a little bit, looking at just how much has burned, and this is just in the current year. The thing that's also important to keep in mind is that we had another bad year last year, and so you start to get an impression of what some of the cumulative effects of some of these fires can be. Looking at fires over time, the red bars here kind of indicate how many acres were burned by year from 1996 through 2016. The top line, the top green line, indicates how many acres burned in 2017. That was 1.3 million acres. And through early September of 2018, the lower green line indicates where we are there, and that's just over 1 million acres within Nevada. So it's pretty substantive. It has a lot of effect, and it has a lot of effects on a lot of different species. Some of those effects differ depending on what species you're talking about, and the effects differ depending upon where the fires occur. One of the other things that looking at is that just the diversity of ownership in the lands that where the fires have occurred. By far, the most has been on the Bureau of Land Management, almost 600,000 acres. 150,000 acres, just over that, has been on the U.S. Forest Service. And then 215,000 acres have been on private land. So State Bureau of Indian Affairs also getting impacted, but the distribution of it is nobody's being spared. One of the primary species that we have concern about are sage grouse, and when we look at the fires that have occurred, these fires have burned across 36 of the active sage grouse leks, 16 of what we call pending active. In other words, we know there's birds there, we're monitoring them, and had they been active, or if they're active for a couple more years, they will be classified as active. 11 of them inactive leks, then these are leks that we know were being used but haven't been used recently, and then 2 historic ones. 650,000 of the priority habitat areas for sage grouse have been burned, and just under 300,000 of the general areas have been burned. Obviously, this is all, again, largely focused up in northeastern Nevada, but this is some of the best sage grouse habitat that we have. Before I go to questions, I'll certainly indicate that I'm not nearly as well versed in this as Division Administrator Janae, but we've invested an awful lot in the recovery of these habitats. Some of the challenges have been discussed here already today, trying to keep cheatgrass from being established in some of these areas, the challenge with trying to establish sometimes a non-native plant that is a very good forage plant for a lot of game species like forage kochia, trying to get that in place, working with the BLM, working with the Forest Service, participating with their seed bank, trying to get the right seeds that are going to be beneficial to wildlife and get it out as rapidly as possible. One question that often comes up is, we've had a couple of years of fires now. We've had a couple of years where we've come to the commission and informed you that we were about to initiate an emergency season for mule deer or for pronghorn. At this point in time, it's not our intent to do that. Those populations, the fires where they have occurred this year, tend to be primarily on their summer range, not so much on the winter range, where we're expecting animals to have to be residing in 3 to 4 months, and where they're going to be in really, really poor condition. If you can think back to that brushy hillside and sliding off of that and landing in a really bad burned over area. What we actually have for the most part is some of the higher elevation habitats. Often the higher elevation habitats have got a little more time to respond before the deer and the antelope are going to be kind of depending upon them again, and they've got actually a little bit longer time for the recovery efforts and the natural regeneration to occur. And so that's kind of where we are with those populations right now. That's based on the feedback that we've received from our biologists in the eastern region. I'd certainly be happy to try to respond to any questions you might have.
Any questions? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Wakely. Director Wasley.
Yeah, I just want to add, before I turn it over to Diversity Division Administrator, Ms. Newmark, to introduce her subject. I just, we talked about it a little bit yesterday. Mr. Chairman, you indicated that you were contacted about possible closure and whether that was something that we should do, we could do. I had some of those conversations as well, and one of the key differences here that Mr. Wakeling just mentioned is a summer range, not winter range. A lot of those opportunities to help these animals through the winter have occurred through these emergency depredation hunts when these fires occur on the winter range. Some of the conversations around what should be done, what could be done. We have tag holders scattered all over the state. Some individuals could be coming into this area, largely unfamiliar with the impacts. There certainly could be scenarios where some of these animals may be vulnerable to increased risk of harvest. Some of these animals could be vulnerable to increased winter losses for some of the reasons that Cody just highlighted on the brushy hillside scenario. However, we certainly have concerns around many of these issues. I don't believe that the department has flexibility, statutorily or otherwise, to provide some of the relief that some tag holders would like. Some of the things that we talked about with the muzzleloader season in particular in 06-1 and 07-1. I do think that it would be prudent for us as a department to take advantage of some of the utility of our new system to reach out to the tag holders. In particular, I'm thinking about the rifle deer hunters, and make sure that those individuals are aware of the magnitude of these fires, make sure they're aware of the potential for erosion, habitat destruction, road damage, and also make them aware that if they choose to turn those tags back, that there's a provision that tags can be turned in for any reason and they can get their bonus points back. If those tags are turned into the department within 2 weeks prior to that hunt, then the department is not statutorily required to reissue that tag. If it's outside of that 2 weeks, then we're required to reissue that tag. So we've had some discussion, although the discussion isn't over, about taking some responsibility to help inform and educate those tag holders. And again, the most, I guess, highest quota and where the greatest, potential for some of those hunters to be affected and habitats to be affected and animals to be affected would be with the rifle deer hunt. And so we'll continue to have this discussion, and we will probably send some informational emails out. There's no guarantee that everybody will open them and everybody will read them and what they'll do with that. But I think it would be good for us to try to have some outreach around some of the impacts of the fire and the potential impacts to habitat and potential impacts to the animals. So I just wanted to share some of those thoughts with you. If you see or hear about those emails or see them, but you'll at least know what our intent is in that regard.
Any increase in the number of tags being returned already? Do you know?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if anybody has looked at that. I know that there are certainly some individuals that have turned their tag in and specifically given that as a reason, but I don't know more than one or two that have conveyed that. Again, the challenge is if the department receives that tag,
you have to reissue it
in excess of 2 weeks before that season. Yeah, statutorily we're required to reissue that, and so we would hope that it's not our desire. Granted, there's revenue, but it's not our desire to make money over the quality of the experience, and we would hopefully be able to interact with individuals wishing to turn those tags in, so they could do it in a way that we weren't required to reissue it.
Understood. All right. We'll move on to Ms. Newmark's presentation.
Good morning.
Good morning.
For the record, Jennifer Newmark. I'm Wildlife Diversity Division Administrator, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Jason Williams, who's going to be providing an update on some of our activities with caves throughout the state. Jason is our one of two Jasons in our division. So, and he is stationed in our Ely office, and he is one of our resident bat experts. He coordinates a lot of the underground work that happens in the state, and you've heard some of my updates in our department activity reports on numbers of abandoned mines, for example, that have been closed for human use but preserved for bat use. And he is our biologist that coordinates that efforts statewide with the BLM as well as the Nevada Division of Minerals. And he also specializes in caves, so he's going to be talking today about some of that work. So I will turn it over to him.
Thank you. Good morning, Commissioners. So this is a collaborative effort. It started out with the BLM, and it's now includes the Forest Service and Great Basin National Park, or the Park Service. And so INDO's obviously interested in knowing what wildlife are using the caves currently and in the recent history. And so this work is obviously limited to locations in Nevada where there's karst formations, so where there's caves. And the teams that we have that go to these caves they consist of archaeologists and paleontologists and recreation specialists of the BLM, the Forest Service, so they know how to manage these caves for recreation, and geologists, and then of course INDO with the biologist. So from a biological perspective, we're conducting disease monitoring like white nose syndrome. We are collecting climate data from over 40 caves and mines in Nevada so that we can understand the variation in these climates and how they change throughout the year based on the physical features of the sites. So like, for example, a cave that has one portal compared to a cave that has two portals is very, very different because of airflow. And airflow equals wind chill and loss of humidity, etc. And so we're collecting all that biological or that climate data to understand that variation. We're also looking at population demographics and migration patterns. So with population demographics, how do the demographics of these roosts change over time? They can change from week to week or season to season or year to year. It really just depends. Some sites are used for hibernation. Some sites are only used for, say, maternity use. Oh, that's supposed to say roost use patterns. And so roosts can be used all throughout the year. Some roosts can be used for just a week. It really depends on the kind of climate and other types of features that they offer the animals. We have passive acoustic monitoring. You can't really see it, but there's a solar panel in the bottom right of that left picture. And then the transducer that's sticking up out of the rocks is basically a microphone that passively records the acoustic sounds of bats. And so just as you can identify a bird by the sound, if you know birds, You don't have to see the bird, you can hear it and know what it is. We can do the same thing with bats with the right equipment. We're using stable isotope analysis to look at the ratios of carbon to nitrogen and hydrogen in some of the hair clippings of a particular species of bat, and that can provide us information on where they're coming from before they arrive here. And then finally, the hibernation work that we're doing. You know, there's a number of mammals, especially bats, that hibernate in Nevada, and understanding how these climates change over time and which roosts are attractive to them helps us manage them. So there's certainly some challenges to this work. Winter access is one of them. It slows everything down, and of course the days are really short, so that gets tricky. Some of these sites are remote. The bottom left picture is a hike to Leviathan Cave. It's about a 7 mile, well, it's only about 4 miles, but it has 4,000 vertical feet of elevation. Some of these sites aren't easy to get to. And of course, some of them are vertical. So the wildlife that we encounter is pretty interesting. You know, species that are still extant today, that still exist today. Everything from lions and bobcats and all sorts of medium mammals, including ringtails and skunks, small mammals, bats, etc. Historically, the first 3 species, deer, sheep, and marmot, they're obviously still extant today. They still exist today. But we see historical use of those species in there. Some of these caves you can go into depending on how the cave is kind of set up and whether or not it has multiple portals or one portal, etc. Some of these caves you can walk into and find you know, American horse that's 50,000 years old, still laying there. And so I used to think it was pretty interesting going underground with geologists, and then I started going underground with paleontologists and archaeologists, and it's just mind-blowing the information that we can get both from today's wildlife and wildlife from the past, and of course human use from the past as well. So these are just a few examples. American cheetah, that's from a cave in Eureka County. American horse is also from a cave in Eureka County and elsewhere. White Pine County has a cave that we found giant short-faced bear remains laying on the surface. They're pretty amazing how well they're protected. Yesterday's camel has been located in Nevada as well, Nevada caves. This is the cave in the Fish Creek Range that I think you folks were interested in hearing some more about. Dr. Hockett gave a presentation at the Nevada chapter of the Wildlife Society about this cave. That's him sitting in the left picture. He's a paleontologist with BLM at their state office, and we went into this cave and found some sheep laying in there, and we knew that sheep aren't currently known from the Fish Creek Range, and so we took Dr. Hockett down this cave. It's a vertical cave, and we ended up finding 4 of them. They radiocarbon dated to the 1850s and 1860s, so when Euro-American man came around is when, you know, sheep were driven out of that range, is the conclusion that Dr. Hockett came to. Obviously found a variety of small and medium mammals in there, including sage grouse, and a sign of historic man. So historic is pretty much from European man forward, you know, the last 150, 200 years. Which cave? Oh, this is a cave in Lincoln County, just off Highway 93. We just surveyed this a few months ago, found current use of mountain lions and small mammals, you know, rabbits, raptors, historic use of yellow-bellied marmots, Marmota flaventris. They're not known from this range currently. They're locally extinct, but they exist like in Meadow Valley Wash and in higher elevations, Snake Range, Spring Mountain, or Shell Creek Range, etc. And it's interesting, again, going underground with these arcs, stuff that somebody trained in biology like me would walk right past. There's atlatl dart shafts that radiocarbon dated to 4,000 years old. And so this cave, you can kind of look in the picture and see how the portal sits. as it was described to me, the archaeologists said they would, the prehistoric man was using this as a funnel to trap the animals in, and then they were hunting them when they were inside the cave. And so if they threw a shaft at, say, a deer or a rabbit or something and missed, and that shaft hit the wall, then the shaft breaks, and that's why these shaft remains lay around today. And the untrained eye, you'd walk right past this stuff and you wouldn't see it. This is a cave in the Worthington Mountains. If you think about like island biogeography theory, water sources are really rare features in these xeric deserts that we're in. And so this cave has water in it year-round. You can see the pool. All that little black stuff is bat feces. And so bats and birds and other animals that can get to this cave use it as a drinking source all the time. It's cold in there. Most caves are cold in Nevada. And so when an animal gets into that water, if they can't get out easily, they die because it's so cold. And so on the top left pictures, those are forearms of bats, and they're the last thing to decay when a bat falls in this water and can't get out. But it's just, it's normal biology. This is a great water source for them. This is a cave in Clark County, down in the Gold Buttes. This cave is one of 2 locations for Macrotus californicus, California leaf-nosed bat, that we know of in the state. That's how rare this species is. And prehistoric man used it from 3,000 to 6,000 years ago, before present. And when the arcs did their work, the archaeologists did their work there, they discovered 3 mule deer, and they radiocarbon dated to almost 4,000 years old, which is coincident with when man was there. So they don't know if, well, I'd have to look at the report, but there was talk in the archaeological report about that site either being where they lived or being like a butcher shop, where they would bring some animals to cut them up. And all this stuff is in caves. You just have to look for it. And these are important resources for Nevada's wildlife today and in the past. I think this is the last example of the caves I wanted to give you. This is a cave in Spring Valley. It's within a few miles of Nevada's only commercial wind farm. It was mined for guano by historic man in the 1900s. Currently, there's a few million bats in there collectively from June to about October. And because of its proximity to the wind farm, we've worked with the operator. They're wonderful to work with. And we've done quite a bit of research at this facility, or at this cave, trying to understand how the bats are going to be impacted by the wind farm. And we've used a lot of different techniques. We've banded 30,000 Mexican free-tailed bats, the bat in the picture there, and as part of a long-term migration study. And then finally, I just wanted to indicate that these are also educational opportunities. For example, the bottom right picture, those 6 adults in the picture are GBI interns doing habitat surveys or plant surveys for the Habitat Division. So we're able to get them out and kind of, broaden their perspective. The rest of the photos are of school children that we take out and educate when we get the chance. The top center photo is just 8 days old. We took the 4th grade Learning Bridge charter school class and some of those students' siblings and parents out to a cave in White Pine County. And we brought out a thermal imaging camera and some other equipment, and they got to watch the bats fly out. And, these bats are coming out at 2,000 to 3,000 a minute. There's peregrine falcons coming down and feeding on them, so it's quite a great opportunity for the kids to see it. And then, of course, Dr. Wolf in the middle, we enjoy the opportunity to get educated ourselves, so she comes out and helps with the projects occasionally. And that's all I had for you, except I wanted to show you a video really quick to kind of show you how active some of these caves are. And at night, it's really hard to know what's going on unless you have the right equipment. I was hoping the video was going to play. So those are not insects, those are bats. This is a cave in Spring Valley. And you'll have to excuse all the data that's on the screen. We use this camera to understand hibernation normally. So these are all animals that have left the cave for the night, and they go out and forage for a little bit, and then they'll come back in and hang up and use that as an opportunity for their food to digest. That happens over, I don't know, maybe an hour, and then they'll go back out and forage more, fill up, come back in. This happens all night long. It's pretty spectacular. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Jason? Commissioner Keel?
Yeah, one quick question. Have you been able to identify any adverse impacts to the bats with that commercial wind farm to date?
No, they've been very pleasant to work with. And so the first year, we purposely didn't do any mitigation because we needed to understand what baseline mortality was. You can't determine how effective your mitigation is if you don't know what the true mortality would be. So that year they reached their threshold, and after that first year we implemented mitigation efforts. They did so voluntarily, and they've never reached threshold since. So they're real pleasant to work with, and they're doing a great job.
Jason, could you maybe explain what that mitigation looks like? Just the technology used to detect the outflight and how that results in changes at the wind farm, please?
I didn't hear the first part of your question.
Could you maybe share what that mitigation for that wind farm looks like, how you're detecting an outflight and what the resultant change at the wind farm, how you're collecting data and how that data is being transferred to the wind farm and mitigating for those mortalities?
Sure. So the cave that you're looking at right now is the cave that's right next to the wind farm in Spring Valley. This is a major migration stopover site for Mexican free-tailed bats. So Cody talked earlier about these areas along migration routes of deer that are crucial for these animals to rest, recoup, eat some more food. This occurs for more than just deer. This is totally applicable to bats as well. So this cave is a stopover site for this species. They come here and they rest based on radio telemetry. We think they rest for about 1 to 4 days, and then they continue on their migration. What you can't see in this picture is that there's a beam brake system on this cave. So, for example, when you walk into the gas station convenience store, you trip that IR beam, and years ago it used to go ding dong because to alert the store clerk that somebody was walking in. Well, it's the same technology. So we have a beam brake system on this cave that is set up to look at both ingress and egress, so animals that are flying in and animals that are flying out. And I say we, it's a collective operation, but the wind farm owns the technology. They're the one that funds it. And the beam brake data feeds the SCADA system of the wind farm. It's an acronym for the computer system that feeds that controls the wind farm. And this beam brake data is uploaded daily, and there are algorithms that they've built to look at the amount of bat activity flying in and out of the cave to determine if they need to turn the wind farm off at night. And so that technology is evolving all the time. A couple years ago, they just set their computers so that the wind farm would not operate at night at wind speeds above, I think it's 4 meters per second from July 1st to September 31st. And now they have the technology to actually look at that in-flight and out-flight data on a daily basis, and the computer can run models and tell the wind farm on a daily basis now whether to shut off or remain on. Excuse me. And so by doing this, they've been able to reduce mortalities by about 70%.
Commissioner McNinch?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, that's amazing. That's new to me. The coordination and stuff and the technology to do that, and the collaboration and coordination that it would take to get something like that in place is, that's amazing, and it's awesome. I appreciate the effort that goes into that. Second of all, I was just going to say, if you, I've had the opportunity to stand right here where this picture was taken with Jason, and if you haven't been out to a place like this, you should go and check it out. It's pretty incredible. When you hear that a couple million bats might be coming out of that cave, you really don't understand what that means until you experience it. There's contact. They not necessarily with you, but they do run into each other, and there's a lot of activity. It's pretty incredible. You should go stand right there. It's beautiful on top of it. It's a beautiful view, and it's pretty incredible. But I would encourage you to go just stand there and watch that. It's pretty neat.
You can't worry about some of the myths about bats. I've been working with them for 20 years, and they don't fly in my hair at all.
Anything else? Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
With that, we'll close agenda item number 17. We'll move on to agenda item 18, Commission Regulations for Possible Action. Agenda item 18A, Commission General Regulation 478, Bighorn Sheep Ewe and Mountain Goat Online Course, LCB file number R151-18, Game Division Administrator Brian Wakeland. The Commission will consider adopting a regulation relating to amending Chapter 502 of the Nevada Administrative Code. This regulation would require all bighorn ewe and mountain goat tag holders to complete an online course. This regulation would eliminate the need for a physical inspection for hunters to harvest a ewe. It would also require the tag holder for ram, bighorn sheep, mountain goat, and mountain lion or bear to provide questionnaire information during the already required post-harvest physical inspection and eliminate the subsequent need for successful tag holders to also submit a questionnaire. The Commission held a workshop on August 10th, 2018, and the Commission directed the Department to move forward with an adoption hearing. Mr. Wakeling.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. Brian Wakeling, Game Division Administrator. As you indicated, this was heard at the last Commission meeting under workshop. There were no changes adopted to the suggested language. I do want to reiterate that there are three primary objectives of this change. One is to require that the ewe bighorn sheep hunters, who draw a ewe tag, and all mountain goat hunters would be required to watch an online video. That online video would be available at any time. It will be on the website, and so it's available to anybody that chooses to watch it, be it a ram hunter or just someone who has interest in it. And that video and seminar largely designed to provide some opportunities for any hunter to have, or any wildlife watcher who has an interest in better identifying gender in those species would have the opportunity to view that and see it. Secondly, the regulation would eliminate the need for the physical inspection of ewes. We don't get an awful lot of information, biological information, off of that. It's an undue burden on the hunter, and it also requires that we have staff available to actually do the checkouts, and so it's a reduction of a burden on us as well as on the hunter. And finally, the people who do have a physical inspection would not have to at that point fill out the online questionnaire as well. You have to have the inspection. You have to check out. We can collect that information at that point. That sums up the changes that we're proposing. I'd be more than happy to try to entertain any questions as the Commission may have.
Any questions? Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not so much a question for Mr. Wakeling, but I did, in reading it this go around, in section 3, subsection 1, so this is at the very top of page 4. where we're taking out the section unless otherwise provided by an annual regulation of the commission. And we're replacing that just with the word the. Because we've added that subsection 3, do we need to put in there except as provided in subsection 3? Because we're providing an exception down below, it's actually just being written in to the questionnaire. So we're saying up in subsection 1, I think we're saying you have to fill out a questionnaire. And then down below, we're saying, really, here's the exception.
I don't think so, because if you look at subsection 1, 502.405 just says the properly completed questionnaire issued as part of a big game tag or the information required must be received by the department not later than the deadline. So there's a deadline. And then subsection 3 says when I go check in, for example, a RAM, I'm going to provide that information at that time. So I, by definition, meet that deadline.
So are you, okay. Okay, so maybe in subsection 2 then, it's talking about a person who fails to return the questionnaire. So that one's specific to the questionnaire.
Or the information.
Oh, excuse me, or the information. I see what you're saying. All right, I think I'm fine then. That makes sense.
And for the record, there is a time frame under which you have to have that physical inspection that is shorter than the other time.
Okay. Commissioner Allenberg?
Yeah, just a comment, in some of the CAB's review of this is they would have liked some language in here that specifically calls out that it's available online. I don't think that we need to. It's just so that they understand, that the CABs understand that it is available to them. I mean, it was multiple CABs that had mentioned that in their report.
The return questionnaire?
No, just that the online video would be available to the general public and not just, it's mandatory for the tag holders,
right?
But it's optional to anybody else. And the question from the CAB was, should there be language in here that calls that out, that it's available to everybody?
My view on that is no, because you're talking about a regulatory requirement. Who has to watch it? And don't get into the weeds in the actual regulation talking about the online video being made available to the public. But I understand, yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, I saw the comments. Any public comment? I'll take it out for public comment starting in Reno.
Comment in Reno, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Public comment in Las Vegas. Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the commission.
I can make a motion.
Somebody, please.
I move that we adopt Commission General Regulation 478 Bighorn Sheep Ewe and Mountain Goat Online Course, LCB file number R151-18 for as presented by the department.
I'll second that.
Okay, I have a motion by Commissioner Hubbs and a second by Vice Chairman Valentine to approve or adopt the regulation as presented, LCB file number R151-18. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries unanimously 8-0 with Commissioner East absent. That will close that agenda item. Move on to agenda item number 18B, Commission General Regulation 479, Rosy Boa Reptile, LCB file number R152-18, Wildlife Diversity Administrator Jennifer Newmark. The Commission will consider adopting a regulation relating to amending Chapter 503 of the Nevada Administrative Code. This amendment would revise the scientific name of the Rosy Boa, which is classified as a protected reptile, from Lichanura travagata to Lichanura oracudi. I didn't take Latin. This name change is needed due to scientific studies that have split the species into two distinct entities, one that occurs in Nevada and one that occurs outside the state. Current NAC protects the species outside Nevada rather than the species that occurs within Nevada. The commission held a workshop on August 10th, 2018, and the commission directed the department to move forward with an adoption hearing. Ms. Newmark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce the names any better than you did, but I'll try.
Sure you
We
could.
need Jason here. This name change was heard at the last commission meeting. There were no changes that were recommended, and we are moving to propose that we adopt this regulation. Just as some background information for you all and a quick recap, the rosy boa is listed as a protected species under Chapter 503 in our NACs. It's listed as Lyncernura trivirgata, and that species has been recently split into two distinct species based on genetic studies. And currently, as listed, the species that we're protecting under Chapter 503 occurs in Baja and Sonora, Mexico, and southern parts of Arizona. So we're protecting a species that doesn't occur in Nevada. So we're recommending that we update the scientific name to Lyncernura orcuti, and that would protect the correct species that occurs in our state as was originally intended. With that, I'd answer any questions.
Any questions for Ms. Newmark? Seeing none. Public comment in Reno?
No comment in Reno, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any public comment in Las Vegas? Seeing no public comment, bring it back to the commission.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to adopt Commission General Regulation 479, Rosy Boa Reptile, LCB file number R152-18 as presented.
Second that.
I have a motion by Commissioner McNinch and seconded by Commissioner Barnes to adopt the Commission General Regulation 479 as presented. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries 8-0 with Commissioner East absent. With that, we'll move on to agenda item 18C, Commission Regulation 18-01, Amendment Number 2, Fishing Seasons Bag and Possession Limits and Regulations for March 1st, 2018 through February 29th, 2020. Fisheries Division Administrator John Schoberg. The Commission will consider amending Commission Regulation 18-01 to modify the harvest limits for Lahontan Reservoir to allow the harvest of white bass or white bass hybrids under 15 inches to be included in the 15 game fish limit in Churchill and Lyon counties, to modify the general harvest limit for Pershing County, to remove the reference to white bass and white bass hybrids, and to adopt a limit of 3 game fish for the James Kinney Pond in Humboldt County. Mr. Schoberg.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson and Commissioners. For the record, John Schoberg, Fisheries Division Administrator. As you had recapped, we're requesting 3 relatively minor changes to Commission Regulation 1801 as Amendment Number 2. The first one is for Lahontan Reservoir in Churchill and Lyon counties. As a very brief background, when this regulation was changed several years ago, the intent was to allow a larger harvest of fish under 15 inches, but unfortunately the language doesn't clearly read that way in the current regulation. So this is just a correction to make clear that that was the intent that supports our management, which is to protect that larger size class of white bass and wipers. The language we're requesting, and we do have one minor change from what was submitted as the support material, because when we reread this again after the support material was sent out, we realized that as it's phrased, as we submitted it to you, you could keep a fish under 15 inches or over 15 inches, but if the fish was 15 inches, you had to let it go. So we want to correct that. So the language we are requesting is essentially the same, other than in the immediately prior to the new paragraph, it will read, I'll just read the whole thing. 15 game fish, of which not more than 5 may be black bass, 5 may be walleye, and 2 may be white bass or white bass hybrids, wipers, 15 inches total or longer, total length or longer. And then the new language to be added is white bass or white bass hybrids, wipers under 15 inches may be included in the 15 game fish limit. So that is the requested change for Lahontan Reservoir. For Pershing County, in reviewing the regulations, this really is just removing a section of the general regulation that doesn't apply. It was never corrected when we established a separate limit and harvest regulation for Rye Patch and the Humboldt River. And this is to remove the language in the current general regulation for Pershing County that says, and 5 may be white bass or white bass hybrids over 14 inches total length. White bass or white bass hybrids under 14 inches total may be included in the 15 game fish limit. The current regulation as written for Rye Patch and the Humboldt River covers all waters in Pershing County that have white bass and white bass hybrids, and this regulation is both unneeded and specifies an old length restriction that's archaic. So this is just to remove that language to make it consistent. And then the third requested change is for the new James Kinney Fishing Pond in Humboldt County, which Director Wasley referenced in his agency report. It'll be opening in a couple of weeks. And we are requesting establishment of a regulation limiting harvest to 3 game fish that is consistent with all other waters in Nevada that are managed as urban fisheries, and keeps the general game fish harvest limit from applying to that water. So those are all the requested changes, and other than James Kinney Pond, they're just cleanup to make sure we're consistent.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing no questions, any public comment in Reno?
No comment in Reno, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Public comment in Las Vegas? No? Bring it back to the commission.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to approve Commission Regulation 18-01, Amendment Number 2, as presented by the Department with the additional revision under Churchill County Open Waters for Lahontan Reservoir. It would read 15 game fish, of which not more than 5 may be black bass, 5 may be walleye, and 2 may be white bass or white bass hybrids, 15 inches or longer total length.
And would you like to address my home county and its portion of Lahontan Reservoir?
I'm sorry, one more time.
Would you like to go on your motion and address my home county of Lyon with respect to Lahontan?
I'm sorry, yes, I missed something, I'm missing it.
Lahontan Reservoir is both in Churchill and Lyon County, so when we make the change
Yes, of course.
for Churchill, we need to make the change for Lyon.
I totally.
We get no love in Lyon County.
I'm thinking it's my eyesight. We'll blame it on that for now. Yes, I got you. I see it. And that would include, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for Lyon County, the same verbiage.
You know, you never forgot Esmeralda County when Grant was chairman.
Yeah. Well, maybe I can make it up to you by saying roll tide.
I second that.
I have a motion and a second. A motion by Commissioner McNinch, a second by Commissioner Hubbs. Is everyone clear on the motion? And the department's good with that? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Any further discussion or questions? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries unanimously 8-0 with Commissioner East absent.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson, Commissioner.
Thank you. With that, we will close agenda item 18, move on to agenda item 19. Unless people want to take a break for lunch. If we take a break for lunch, we'll be reconvening at 3:30, 3:45. after the Alabama game's over. Agenda item number 19, Yakima Tribe Pronghorn Translocation Update, Wildlife Staff Specialist Cody Schroeder. The department will provide an update regarding the translocation of pronghorn to fulfill the original request from the Yakima Tribe in Washington for 100 pronghorn, originally approved by the Commission for fiscal year 2018. In fiscal year 2018, only 50 of the original 100 were provided to the Yakima Tribe in Washington. Mr. Schroeder.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Johnson, members of the commission. I promise this presentation will be much shorter than the mule deer. Just a few slides. For the record, Cody Schroeder, Staff Specialist, Department of Wildlife. So I just want to briefly go over kind of the background on this and update the commission. This is going to be review, but back in early 2000, we received requests for pronghorn from the Yakima, both Yakima Nation and Colville tribes in Washington. The Board of Commissioners approved that request for 200 animals at the September 23rd commission meeting here in Las Vegas. We successfully conducted that capture last October. On the 23rd and 24th, we translocated a little over 100 to the Colville tribes. And then the next day, we captured another 52 for the Yakima. So we didn't quite get to our goal of 200, just had some logistical constraints there. Composition of that herd was 30 adult females, 8 juvenile males, 14 juvenile females. They did provide us, both tribes provided us reports, and we actually had them at the pronghorn workshop that we hosted give us an update. We supplied that for support material. At that pronghorn workshop, as I mentioned, the Yakima Nation did express interest in receiving the remainder of the requests there for fiscal year 19, and so the department is requesting approval from the commission to sort of fulfill this final 50 for this coming fall winter. And our pronghorn capture would likely take place in some of the same areas that we used last year for stock, primarily Area 6 in Elko County. And that is all I have for that, so if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take
questions for Mr. Schroeder? Commissioner Hubbs?
I guess the only question is, I mean, our numbers are up for pronghorn, so you don't have any concerns about taking the 50 additional pronghorn in terms of the numbers and abundance and whatever we have for this calendar year?
Commissioner Hubbs, that's correct. You know, we even before when we proposed that, we felt like we had enough, and some of the fire conversations we had earlier, we really feel like we have sort of an overabundance in some cases of pronghorn available, sort of relieve some pressure off some of those areas that have burned, that have been, pronghorn have been affected by those fires too. So rather than propose like a depredation hunt or something, we felt like since there's a need for the pronghorn from another state, we'd fulfill that.
Any additional questions? Any public? I'll just start with public comment then, and starting in Reno.
No comment in Reno, Mr. Chairman.
Any public comment in Las Vegas? Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the commission.
I'll make a motion to approve the transfer of 50 additional pronghorns to the Yakima tribe as proposed by the department.
I'll second.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think the agenda item's for an additional 50. It's just to fulfill the original total of 100 is what it looks like to me. 200.
Okay, I can revise that motion. I would move to approve the transfer of the original 50 that were to be transferred last year as presented by the department.
Is the second fine with that?
Second is fine with that.
Okay. I have a motion by Commissioner Hubbs and a second by Vice Chairman Valentine to approve the department's request to proceed to translocate 50 pronghorn to the Yakima tribe in Washington to fulfill the original 200 animal request. Everyone clear on the question? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries 8-0 with Commissioner East absent. With that, we'll move on to agenda item number 20, future commission meetings and commission committee assignments. Secretary Tony Wasley and Chairman Johnston for possible action. The next commission meeting is scheduled for November 2nd and 3rd, 2018 in Reno. The commission will review and discuss potential agenda items for that meeting. The commission may change the time and meeting location at this time. The chairman may designate and adjust committee assignments as necessary at this meeting. Secretary Wasley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The planning calendar for commission meetings indicate that the main issues, main items of business for that meeting will be taking raptors for falconry seasons and quotas. Those are set in even-numbered years and amended in odd-numbered years, this being an even-numbered year. I believe that'll come before you. And then also the non-commercial collection seasons and limits for live unprotected reptiles and amphibians, set again in even-numbered years, amended in odd-numbered years. We'll also have the predation management status report. Historically, we had the application hunt draw report. I don't know if that's necessary at this point, having recently had that in Caliente and then also going over some of those numbers at this meeting. But of course, if it's the commission's desire, we can report on that at any point in time. We will also have the Wildlife Trust account semi-annual report. I don't know if there are any possible adoption hearings. The regulations that we heard here is for workshop. It's my understanding from the discussion that there may not be a desire to pursue those at this point, or to choose other options, including the deer and antelope compensation take program, as well as the shotgun gauges legal for turkey hunting.
I think that the turkey hunting regulation needs to come back to the commission for adoption, because there is a cleanup piece separate and apart from the gauge piece, so that needs to go on the agenda for adoption hearing.
Okay. Possible other regulations for workshop in November would include the SWAN permit regulation, the sellable lists. Those are the only ones there. Then also we will have the standing agenda item for the Department of Wildlife project updates. Yesterday there was an expressed desire to elevate the importance of the sage habitat. There are a number of efforts underway in that arena, more broad than just what the Department of Wildlife has. I'm happy to share those under that agenda item, or even have a separate agenda item to share some of those efforts if there's a desire to hear that. And then we also will need to determine at that meeting the names of the commissioner or commissioners who will attend the midwinter WAFWA meeting. There may be a desire to also have a TAC meeting.
There will be a TAC committee meeting.
Okay.
Where is the midwinter WAFWA meeting?
Tucson, Arizona. And those are the items I have.
And I will be announcing committee assignments at that point in time. I need to do some cleanup with Grant's departure and look at all the committee assignments in that. Anything else?
No, sir. That concludes the items I have on my list.
This was set for possible action. I don't know if we're going to take any, but I will take it out for any public comment in Reno regarding the future commission meetings and committee assignments.
No comment in Reno.
Thank you. Any public comment in Las Vegas? And with that, we'll close agenda item number 20 and move on to the final agenda item, number 21, public comment period. Persons wishing to speak are requested to complete a speaker's card and present it to the recording secretary. Public comment will be limited to 3 minutes. No action can be taken by the commission at this time. Any item requiring commission action may be scheduled on a future commission agenda. Let's start in Reno. Any public comment in Reno?
No. No public comment in Reno, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Public comment in Las Vegas. Mr. Reese.
If I could ask Director Wasley if he'd help me hand these out. I did a quick little handout for everybody and also one for the DAG. For the record, Mike Reese, representing myself. In this, I've got 3 little cutouts that I stapled in there. One was a copy of the proclamation the governor did yesterday that goes into effect today, so you actually have a copy of that. The first item on there, and especially this is for the DAG, it's NRS 501.265. It's the manner in which we appoint members to our CAB. This isn't being adhered to by county commissioners throughout the state, and I would strongly urge either the DAG or the state board to issue letters out to commissioners throughout the state, notifying them, especially look at item 3A1, which basically says within 60 days after a vacancy occurs, the Board of County Commissioners shall, if the vacant member was appointed, pursuant to section 1, appoint a member to the board upon the recommendation. And this isn't what's happening. Organizations that represent hunters, trappers, or anglers. Basically, you're getting a letter of recommendation from somebody to go with your application for that. That is not being fulfilled. Okay, number 2 was the copy of the proclamation. Number 3 is a quick little article you guys may have gotten. If not, it's a neat one. It's put out by Congressional Sportsman's Foundation. It's a short one. The highlights of this, I'd like to tell you, $93 billion last year was put into our economy by hunters and fishers throughout the United States. That's a big number. That's a B for billion. If all of us hunters, fishermen, were a major single corporation, we would be 25th on the list of the Fortune 500. We would be higher than Microsoft. This is how much hunters and anglers throughout the United States contribute to our economy and to wildlife conservation. I'd just like to get that out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reese. Any further public comment in Las Vegas? Mr. Dixon, come on down.
For the record, Paul Dixon speaking on behalf of myself. Just so I can delay you getting to the Alabama game, few seconds. No, what I wanted to do here is I wanted to talk to Tony and the department staff, and I wanted to let them know that I wanted to personally thank in public Suzanne Scorby's service to this organization. I've been a CAB chairman for 10 years, and I really enjoyed interacting with her, and she'll be missed. Tony, I sent her a personal letter, but I wanted to make a public announcement that I think her retirement is something that all of us are going to feel an impact of just because she's been an icon here. Thank you.
And might Suzanne be in attendance at the November Commission meeting by chance?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, she will. We will have an opportunity to honor her and acknowledge her dedicated service to the state in November, and her family will be in attendance as well.
Thank you. I assume so, but wanted to confirm. Mr. Cook?
Bob Cook, Douglas Cab. I want to ditto Paul Dixon's remarks about Suzanne. She was an exceptional employee. She is definitely going to be missed. I sent her a personal letter myself this morning. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. Any further public comment in Las Vegas? Seeing none, we will stand adjourned and thank everyone for getting through this meeting quickly this morning. Everyone have safe travels home.